The entire valley held its breath the day Caleb Turner's mail-order bride stepped off that stagecoach. What they saw wasn't the sturdy farm wife they'd expected. It was a young Chinese woman in a crimson dress that blazed like wildfire against the dust. Whispers cut through the crowd like barbed wire. Caleb stood frozen, his calloused hands clenching and unclenching, wondering if desperation had finally broken his mind. He'd gambled everything on a stranger. The drought was killing his land. His neighbors were circling like vultures. And now this. If you're watching from your city, drop a comment below so I can see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The Montana sun beat down on Caleb Turner's shoulders like a hammer on an anvil, relentless and unforgiving. He stood at the edge of Clearwater Station, though there'd been no clear water in these parts for near 8 months, watching the stagecoach rumble toward him through clouds of alkali dust. His shirt stuck to his back despite the dry heat, and his hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with the brim of his hat. 3 years. 3 years since Margaret died, bringing their stillborn son into the world. 3 years of cooking his own tasteless meals, mending his own shirts with crooked stitches, watching his ranch slowly die from neglect and heartbreak. The garden Margaret had loved was nothing but brittle stalks now. The curtains she'd sewn hung in tatters. Even the house seemed to sag with grief. But it was the drought that had finally broken him. 6 months without rain. The creek had slowed to a trickle, then to mud, then to nothing but cracked earth and the memory of water. His cattle were getting thin. His neighbors, the Johnsons and the Pratts, had already lost half their herds. Every morning Caleb woke to the sound of wind rattling through empty spaces, and every night he fell asleep counting the days until he'd have nothing left to count. That's when he'd done it. Late one whiskey-soaked night, he'd written to the matrimonial agency in San Francisco. The letter had been short, honest to the point of brutality. Widowed rancher, 34, owns 300 acres in Montana Territory, needs wife for companionship and help with ranch. Life is hard. Winter is harder, won't lie to you about that. But the land is good when it wants to be, and I'm not a cruel man. He'd sent it off before he could change his mind, along with $20 he couldn't afford to spare. Now, watching the stagecoach slow to a stop, he wondered what kind of desperate woman would answer such a letter. The driver, old Pete Hennigan, climbed down with a knowing smirk. "Got a delivery for you, Turner." Caleb's stomach clenched. Around him, what seemed like half of Ashford had gathered, drawn by gossip that traveled faster than any stagecoach. He could see Widow Shelby in her black dress, arms crossed, the Pratt brothers leaning against the mercantile, grinning like they'd come to watch a hanging. Even Reverend Michaels had wandered over, though he had the decency to look sympathetic. The stagecoach door opened. What stepped out wasn't what anyone expected. She was small, barely came up to Caleb's shoulder, but she moved with the precision of someone who'd learned to make every motion count. Her dress was the color of poppies, silk that caught the light and seemed to shimmer with every breath. Black hair pulled back in a braid that fell past her waist, skin like polished amber, and eyes, dark eyes that swept across the crowd with the same careful assessment a rancher gives a string of horses at auction. She was Chinese. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. His letter hadn't specified. He'd never thought. The silence stretched so thin it could snap. Then Widow Shelby's voice cut through. "Well, I'll be damned." Someone laughed, nervous, uncertain. The sound spread like sickness through the crowd. Caleb saw Leanne's expression change, just for a moment. Something flickered there. Not fear, but a kind of tired recognition, like she'd heard this laughter before in 100 different towns. Caleb stepped forward before he could think better of it. "Miss Joe." Her eyes found his. She nodded once, crisp and efficient. "Mr. Turner." Her English carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as a second language, each word weighted and placed with intent. "I received your letter." Yes, I sent it." Caleb's mind was racing, trying to catch up with a situation that had already run away from him. "You came all this way?" "I did." She turned to retrieve a single battered trunk from the stagecoach. Caleb moved to help, but she'd already lifted it herself, managing the weight with practiced ease. "Shall we go?" It wasn't really a question. Caleb became aware of the crowd again, their stares drilling into his back. He could hear the whispers already starting, low and mean. Tomorrow it would be all over the valley. The widower Turner had sent for a bride and gotten himself a China girl. They'd be laughing about it for months. "My wagon's this way?" He gestured down the street. They walked in silence, the trunk balanced on Leanne's shoulder, Caleb's boots kicking up little clouds of dust with each step. Behind them, the whispers grew louder. He caught fragments. Must be desperate. What was he thinking? Those people. Leanne's expression never changed. She looked straight ahead, as if the words were just wind, unpleasant, but ultimately unable to touch her. The wagon was tied up outside the mercantile. Old Murphy's gray gelding stood patient in the traces, swishing flies with his tail. Caleb helped Leanne up to the bench. She accepted his hand with the same neutral courtesy she'd shown everything else, then climbed up beside her. "It's about an hour to the ranch," he said, snapping the reins. "Road's rough." "I've known rough roads." They rolled out of town between buildings that seemed to lean in and watch them pass. Caleb kept his eyes forward, but he could feel the weight of judgment pressing down like humidity before a storm. This was a mistake. He'd made a terrible mistake. The whole valley would be talking. His neighbors would... "You did not expect me." Leanne's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Caleb glanced at her. She was looking at him now, her expression unreadable. No. I didn't know that the agency would send a Chinese woman to answer your letter." She said it matter-of-factly, without heat. "They did not tell you." "No, they didn't." Caleb felt heat rise in his face. "Not that it... but you are wondering if you made a mistake." Still that same calm tone, like they were discussing the weather. "You are thinking about the people in town. What they will say. What they already are saying." Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no point in lying. "Yeah, I am." Leanne nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. She turned her attention back to the road, watching the dusty ruts unroll beneath the wagon wheels. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Finally, she spoke again. "In San Francisco, I worked in a laundry, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The soap ate my hands." She held them up, small hands, scarred and calloused in ways that spoke of hard labor. "The building had no windows. We breathed steam and lye until our lungs burned. At night, 8 of us slept in one room above the shop. The landlord charged each of us $3 a month for the privilege." Caleb listened, unsure where this was going. "I saved for 2 years," Leanne continued, "every penny I could spare, because I knew that if I stayed, I would die there. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year. But eventually, my lungs would give out, or the fever would come, or I would simply stop being able to stand one more day of steam and soap and sleeping with my knees pulled to my chest because there was no room to stretch out." She turned to look at him again. "So when I saw your letter at the agency, I read it 3 times. 'Life is hard,' you wrote. 'Winter is harder.' You did not lie about that." "No, I didn't." "Good. I have no use for pretty lies." Her eyes held his. "You're asking yourself if you made a mistake. I'm asking myself the same question. But I think we are both past the point of turning back, Mr. Turner. So perhaps we should see what comes next before deciding we have failed." It was the most words she'd spoken in sequence, and they hung in the air between them like a challenge. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but maybe the absence of immediate despair. "All right," he said. "All right, we'll see." They rode on. The road climbed gradually into hill country, winding between stands of cottonwood that stood bare and skeletal in the drought. Grasshoppers burst from the dry grass at their approach, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its descending call. The sun tracked across the sky, and shadows began to lengthen. Leanne didn't speak again, but she watched everything. Her eyes tracked the landscape with the intensity of someone reading a book in a foreign language, working to understand not just what was there, but what it meant. When they passed the dry creek bed that should have been running with water, she leaned forward slightly, studying the cracked earth. When they crested a rise and could see the distant mountains, she went very still. "The mountains," she said softly. "They have snow." "Year-round snowpack on the peaks," Caleb confirmed. "Feeds the creeks when it melts, or used to anyway." The water has not disappeared, Lian said, almost to herself. Water does not disappear. It only moves. Caleb wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't. They drove on. The Turner Ranch appeared as they rounded a final bend. 300 acres of brown grass and dust, the house a weathered structure of log and board that had seen better days. The barn sagged to one side, its roof missing shingles. The corral fence had gaps where rails had fallen and not been replaced. The garden was a graveyard of dead plants and exposed earth. Caleb saw it all through Lion's eyes and felt shame curl in his stomach. This wasn't a ranch anymore. It was barely a homestead. It was a place that had given up. "This is it," he said, and the words came out flat. Lian climbed down from the wagon before he could help her, retrieving her trunk with that same efficient motion. She stood for a moment, hands on her hips, surveying the property with narrowed eyes. "The well?" she asked. Caleb pointed to the stone structure near the house. "Still has water, for now, but it's getting low." "And the barn?" "Needs work. I've got 4 horses, 6 cattle left. Used to have 20 head before the drought." "The garden?" "Dead. All of it." He couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "My wife used to tend it. I'm no good with growing things." Lian walked toward the garden, or what was left of it. She knelt, pushing aside brittle tomato stalks to dig her fingers into the soil. She brought up a handful, letting it sift through her fingers, rubbing it between thumb and forefinger. "The soil is not dead," she said. "Only sleeping. It's been sleeping for 8 months. Then perhaps it is time to wake it up." She stood, brushing her hands on her dress, that beautiful red silk now marked with dust and dirt. "Show me the house." Inside was worse than outside. Caleb knew it, had known it even as he'd tried to tidy up yesterday. The place still smelled of loneliness and neglect. Dishes were stacked in the dry sink. The floor needed sweeping. The windows were so grimy they barely let in light. Margaret's rocking chair sat in the corner, a blanket she'd never finished knitting still draped over one arm. Lian set her trunk down and walked through the main room slowly, taking inventory. She ran one finger along the mantel, examining the dust that came away. She looked up at the ceiling where water stains marked old leaks. She tested the pump at the sink. It coughed and sputtered, but eventually produced a thin stream. "You have 1 bedroom?" she asked. "Yes. I can sleep in the barn." "That would be foolish. The nights are cold." She opened the bedroom door, peered inside at the unmade bed and the clothes scattered on the floor. "I will sleep here. You will sleep on the floor in the main room until we decide what arrangement suits us both." It wasn't a question. Caleb found himself nodding. "I will need water for cleaning," Lian continued, already moving toward the kitchen. "Soap if you have it. Rags, a broom. Before dark, I want this floor swept and the windows clean enough to see through. Tomorrow we will begin on the rest." "Miss Joe, you just arrived. You don't need to—" She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that stopped his protest cold. Not anger exactly, more like determination so absolute it had worn away everything else. "Mr. Turner," she said quietly, "I did not travel 800 miles to sit in a corner and watch your ranch die. I came here to work. So let me work." What could he say to that? He nodded again, feeling suddenly useless in his own home. They worked until sunset. Lian proved to be exactly what she'd claimed, a worker of fierce efficiency. She swept the floor with short, hard strokes that raised clouds of dust. She hauled water from the well in buckets, heating it on the stove to wash the windows until they gleamed. She scrubbed the dishes and organized the kitchen with the precision of someone who understood that everything should have its place. Caleb tried to help, but mostly he felt like he was in the way. This was women's work, he kept thinking, then felt foolish for thinking it because Lian clearly didn't need anyone's permission or assistance. She moved through the house like water finding new channels, reshaping the space around her. By the time darkness fell, the main room was transformed. The floor was clean. The windows caught the last light. The dishes were put away. Even the air smelled different, less like stale grief, more like soap and possibility. Lian stood in the center of it, surveying her work. A strand of hair had escaped her braid, and her dress was damp with sweat despite the evening cool. She looked exhausted. She also looked satisfied. "Better," she said. "Tomorrow, better still." Caleb made dinner, beans and bacon, the same meal he'd been eating for months. It wasn't much, but Leon ate without complaint, chewing slowly and deliberately. They sat at the table Margaret had insisted on buying from a carpenter in Ashford, and the silence between them wasn't entirely uncomfortable. "Tell me about the drought," Leon said finally. "When did it start?" "Spring, March, maybe early April. The snow melt came, but it was light. Then the rains just stopped. We've had maybe 2 storms since then. Nothing that lasted, nothing that soaked in deep. And the well? Getting lower every week. I've been rationing the water for the stock. The garden was the first thing to go. Couldn't justify watering vegetables when the cattle were thirsty." Leon nodded, absorbing this. "In China, in the village where I was born, we had droughts. Sometimes for years. My grandfather used to say that water is like wisdom. It flows to the lowest place and waits there until you are humble enough to dig for it. Your grandfather sounds like he knew something about surviving hard times." "He did. He also died of thirst when I was 7, during the dry season of 1871. She said it without emotion, just stating a fact. Wisdom does not always save you, but it gives you something to hold on to when the earth offers nothing else. After dinner, Caleb laid out his bedroll on the floor near the stove. Leon took her trunk into the bedroom and closed the door. He heard her moving around in there, the soft sounds of unpacking, then silence. He lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling beams he'd helped Margaret's father cut and raise 7 years ago. The house creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, one of the horses whickered softly. He'd brought a stranger into his home, a foreign woman who'd lived a life he couldn't begin to imagine. Tomorrow, the whole valley would be talking about his Chinese bride. The Pratts would make jokes. Widow Shelby would purse her lips. Even those who didn't say anything to his face would be thinking it. But as he drifted towards sleep, what he kept coming back to was the way Leon had knelt in the dead garden and said the soil was only sleeping. The certainty in her voice, as if she could see something he'd long since stopped looking for. Maybe she could. Or maybe they were both just desperate enough to believe in impossible things. Either way, it was too late to turn back now. Caleb woke to the sound of the front door opening. He sat up, disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness. A figure moved past him, Leon already dressed, her braid swinging as she walked toward the well. He scrambled up, pulling on his boots. "What are you doing?" "Working." She lowered the bucket into the well, hauled it up with steady pulls. "The day begins whether we are ready or not." By the time full light came, she'd already watered the horses and filled the trough for the cattle. She'd found the chicken coop, empty for 2 years since a fox had gotten the last of the hens, and was examining it with a critical eye. "You should have chickens," she said when Caleb emerged from the house, still trying to wake up. "Eggs, meat, fertilizer for the garden." "Had chickens, lost them." "Then get more." She moved on, walking the perimeter of the corral. One of the horses, a bay mare named Copper, came to the fence to investigate. Leon held out her hand, letting the mare sniff her fingers, then stroked the velvet nose with gentle certainty. "This one is nervous. She has been alone too long. They're all nervous, half wild since I stopped working with them regular. Then we work with them now." She opened the corral gate and stepped inside. Caleb's heart jumped. "Miss Joe, wait, that mare bites. She's not—" But Leon was already approaching Copper, moving with that same deliberate calm she'd shown everything else. The mare tossed her head, backing up, ears flat. Leon stopped, stood still, waited. "Easy," she murmured, and the word was barely more than breath. "Easy now." She took one step, then another. The mare trembled but held her ground. When Leon was close enough, she reached out, slow, so slow, and placed her hand on the horse's neck. Copper didn't bite, didn't bolt, just stood there quivering while this small woman stroked her with long, steady movements. "See?" Leon said, not taking her eyes off the horse. "She does not want to be alone. She wants to remember what it is to trust." Caleb watched from the fence rail, something tight in his chest loosening. This woman, this stranger. She'd been here less than a day and already she was changing things. Not with force, not with demands, just by refusing to accept that broken things had to stay broken. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Caleb worked the ranch, mending fences, tending to the cattle, rationing the dwindling water. Leon worked the house and everything around it. She scrubbed and organized and repaired with relentless efficiency. The garden became her particular focus. Every morning she was out there, clearing dead plants, turning soil, studying the land with an intensity that bordered on devotion. On the third day, she disappeared for 2 hours. When she came back, she was carrying bundles of plants, wild asparagus, mustard greens, cattail roots. "Where did you find those?" Caleb asked. "The creek bed. There is no surface water, but in the deep shade where the willows are, the ground is still damp. Plants that can reach the deep water survive." She laid them out on the kitchen table like treasures. "We can eat these, and I can transplant some to the garden, teach them to grow where we want them." That night they had greens with dinner, bitter and tough, but green, alive. It was the first fresh food Caleb had tasted in months. On the fourth day, the Pratts rode over. Sam and Daniel Pratt, brothers who ran the adjoining spread. They sat their horses outside the corral, making a show of looking the place over. "Heard you got yourself a bride, Turner," Sam called out. He was the older one, thick through the middle, with a beard that looked like steel wool. "Thought we'd come see if the rumors were true." Caleb walked out to meet them, aware of Leon watching from the garden. "They're true enough? What can I do for you?" "Do for us?" Daniel laughed. He had a mean laugh, like stones grinding together. "Hell, Caleb, we came to make sure you hadn't lost your mind, bringing a Chinaman's daughter all the way out here." "She's my wife," Caleb said, keeping his voice level. "Or will be once we make it to the preacher." "Your wife?" Sam spit tobacco juice onto the ground. "That what you're calling it? Because the way I heard it, you paid money for her. That's not a wife, Turner. That's something else entirely." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt anger kindle in his gut, but before he could respond, Leon walked over. She moved with her usual efficiency, covering the ground quickly, and came to stand beside Caleb. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice was perfectly polite. "You have come to visit. This is kind. Would you like water for your horses?" The Pratt stared at her. Sam's face was doing something complicated. Surprise and contempt fighting for dominance. "We don't need nothing from you," he said finally. "Then you need nothing from us." Leanne's expression didn't change. "Good day." She turned and walked back to the garden, dismissing them as completely as if they'd already left. Caleb saw Daniel's face flush red. "You gonna let her talk to us like that?" he demanded. "She offered you water and you refused, not much else to say." Caleb kept his stance relaxed, but his hands were ready. "If there's business between us, speak it plain. Otherwise, you're wasting daylight." The brothers exchanged looks. Sam leaned forward in his saddle. "All right, here's plain speaking. You're making a mistake. That woman's got no place here. The valley's got standards, ways of doing things. You might think you're desperate enough to ignore that, but the rest of us aren't going to forget. I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm asking you to mind your own business." "This is our business when you're making all of us look bad," Daniel gestured broadly. "What's the next ranch over going to think when word spreads that one of us brought in a Chinese woman? What kind of people they going to think we are?" "The kind who judge a person by their work instead of the color of their skin," Caleb said. "Now, if you boys are done, I've got a fence that needs mending." He turned his back on them, a calculated risk, but one that paid off. After a moment, he heard the horses wheel around, hooves drumming as the Pratts rode off. Leanne was still working in the garden when he walked over. She had her hands in the earth, transplanting one of the wild mustard plants. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said. "Do what?" "Stand up to them. They're not good men, especially when they think they've been disrespected." Leon patted soil around the transplant with care. "I have met many men like them. In San Francisco, in Sacramento, in every place I have lived. They are always the same. They think that because I am small, because I am a woman, because I am Chinese, I can be frightened." She looked up at him, and there was something fierce in her eyes. "But I'm not easily frightened, Mr. Turner. I have seen too much to be afraid of men with loud voices and small thoughts." That night, lying on his bedroll in the dark, Caleb thought about strength. He'd always imagined it as something you could measure, how much weight you could lift, how long you could work, how hard you could fight. But watching Leon kneel in the dirt, transplanting wild plants with gentle hands, or stand perfectly still while a half-wild horse learned to trust her again, or face down 2 men on horseback with nothing but polite dismissal. That was strength too. A different kind, maybe a better kind. On the 7th day, disaster struck. Caleb woke to the sound of cattle bawling, not the usual complaint of hungry stock, but something urgent and distressed. He was out of the house and running before he was fully awake, Leanne close behind him. In the corral, one of his cows, a young heifer, barely 3 years old, was down and thrashing. Her sides were distended, her eyes rolling white with panic. Caleb's stomach dropped. "Breech birth," he said, and the words tasted like ash. Calves turned wrong. He'd seen this before. The calf would die. Probably the mother too, if he didn't act fast. The merciful thing would be to end it quickly, put the heifer out of her misery before she suffered too long. "Get my rifle," he told Leon. "It's in the house, above the—" "No." Leon was already moving toward the cow. "Not yet. Miss Joe, there's nothing to be done. I've seen this before. If the calf is breech and can't turn, then we turn it." She knelt beside the heifer, running her hands along the distended belly with quick, assessing touches. "How long has she been laboring?" "I don't know. She was fine last night." "Then not long. We have time." Leon stood, all business. "I need hot water, clean cloths, soap, rope, quickly." Caleb didn't move. "You've done this before?" "In my village, I helped with births, cows, goats, horses, sometimes women when the midwife needed an extra pair of hands." She looked at him. "I cannot promise success, but I can promise that doing nothing guarantees death. So choose, Mr. Turner. Do we try or do we surrender?" He ran for the house. By the time he returned with the supplies, Leon had calmed the heifer somehow, speaking to her in low, rhythmic Chinese, one hand stroking the cow's neck. She'd removed her outer dress and stood in just her undergarments, practical and unselfconscious as a surgeon. "Hold her head," Leon instructed. "Talk to her. Keep her still." What followed was the longest hour of Caleb's life. He knelt in the dirt, holding the heifer's head in his lap, whispering meaningless reassurances while Leanne worked. Her hands disappeared inside the birth canal, feeling for the calf's position. Her face was a mask of concentration, sweat beading on her forehead despite the morning cool. "Front legs are folded back," she murmured. "Head is turned. No wonder she cannot push it out." "Can you fix it?" "We will see." She worked in silence after that, making small adjustments, repositioning the calf with careful precision. The heifer groaned and thrashed weakly. Caleb held on, his arms aching, watching Leon's face for any sign of success or defeat. Then, suddenly, Leon's expression changed. "There. Front legs are forward now. The head—" She bit her lip, making one final adjustment. "Yes. The calf is turned. Will it come now? If we are fortunate." She withdrew her arms, cleaned them quickly with the water and soap. "Now we wait for the next contraction." It came within minutes, the heifer's whole body tensing, pushing. Leon positioned herself at the rear, ready to guide. Another contraction, then another, and then, in a rush of fluid and membrane, the calf slid free. It lay motionless in the dirt. Caleb's heart sank. They'd turned it, brought it into the world, but too late. The calf was— Leon grabbed a cloth and began rubbing the calf vigorously, clearing its nostrils, stimulating circulation. "Come on," she muttered. "Breathe, breathe." Nothing. She kept rubbing, moving down to the calf's chest, pressing rhythmically. "Breathe." The calf's ribs expanded, a wet, rattling gasp. Then another, its eyes opened, unfocused and bewildered. "There you are," Leon whispered. The heifer raised her head, lowing softly. Leon guided the calf around to where its mother could reach it, and the cow began licking her baby with long, devoted strokes. Caleb sat back in the dirt, weak with relief. Leanne remained kneeling, watching mother and calf with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Her arms were smeared with blood and birth fluids. Her hair had come loose from its braid. She looked exhausted and magnificent. "You saved them," Caleb said, and his voice came out rough. "We saved them," Leanne corrected. She stood, a little unsteady, and Caleb quickly rose to support her elbow. She accepted the help without comment. "The mother will need extra feed, water. The calf should nurse within the hour. Watch to make sure it happens." "I will." They walked back to the house in the strengthening light. At the door, Leanne paused. "Your neighbors," she said. The Pratt brothers. They would have shot the cow. Yes. They would have said it was mercy, that there was no other choice. That's what I would have done too, Caleb admitted, before you stopped me. Leon nodded slowly. There is always another choice, Mr. Turner. It is only that sometimes the other choice requires more courage, more work, more faith that the work will matter. She looked back toward the corral, where the calf was struggling to stand on wobbling legs. That is the difference between surviving and living. Surviving is easy. You point the rifle, you pull the trigger, you bury what dies. Living. She turned back to him. Living is harder. It means you dig in the dirt, you turn the calf, you wait to see if it breathes, and sometimes it does not work. Sometimes everything dies anyway, but you tried, and that trying is what makes you human. She went inside to clean up, leaving Caleb standing on the porch with her words echoing in his head. He thought about the past 3 years, the slow surrendering of everything Margaret had built, the garden he'd let die, the horses he'd stopped training, the ranch he'd allowed to crumble while he waited for the drought to break, or his money to run out, or some other ending to arrive and make the choice for him. He'd been surviving, just barely, but he hadn't been living. Inside he could hear Leon moving around, the pump squeaking as she drew water. In the corral, the newborn calf had found its feet and was nursing, its tail switching with contentment while its mother stood patient and proud. The sun climbed higher. The drought continued, relentless as ever, but something had shifted. Some small, stubborn seed of possibility had been planted in ground Caleb had thought was too hard to hold anything living. He didn't know if it would grow, but for the first time in 3 years, he wanted to find out. Word spread faster than prairie fire. By the time Caleb drove into Ashford the following Saturday for supplies, it seemed every person in the valley had heard about the Chinese woman who'd saved a breech calf with her bare hands. The story had grown in the telling, naturally. Some versions had Leon performing surgery with a kitchen knife. Others claimed she'd spoken words in her foreign tongue that made the calf turn itself around. But the core remained true. What should have been death had become life, and people noticed. They noticed in different ways. Martha Henderson, who ran the dry goods store, actually smiled when Caleb walked in. "Heard about your cow," she said, measuring out flour into a burlap sack. "My husband said it was something to see, the way your wife worked. He was riding past your place, saw the whole thing from the road." Caleb hadn't realized they'd had an audience. She knew what she was doing. Clearly, Martha tied off the sack with practiced efficiency. "Tell her if she ever wants to help with difficult birthings. There's folks around here who'd pay for that knowledge. My sister lost 2 calves last spring to breech presentations. Could have used someone who knew how to turn them." But outside the store, Caleb ran into Thomas Pratt, Daniel's son, barely 20 and already carrying his father's meanness like an inheritance. He was leaning against a post with 2 of his friends, and they watched Caleb load supplies into his wagon with expressions that made the air feel tight. "Hey, Turner," Thomas called out. "Heard your China girl's got magic hands." The other boys snickered. Caleb kept loading. "My pa says she probably learned it working in one of them whorehouses in San Francisco. Said that's where most of the Chinese women end up." Caleb's hand stilled on the flour sack. He turned slowly. "Your pa's got a big mouth and a small brain. Seems like it runs in the family." Thomas pushed off the post, his friends flanking him. "You calling my father a liar?" "I'm calling him ignorant. There's a difference, though not much of one." Caleb set down the sack carefully, his muscles coiling. "My wife's worked harder in a week than you've worked in your entire life. So if you've got something to say about her, say it plain, but think real careful before you do." For a moment, it could have gone either way. Thomas was young and stupid enough to push it, but old Pete Hennigan, the stagecoach driver, stepped out of the saloon at just the right moment. "Problem here, boys?" The tension broke like a snapped rope. Thomas spat in the dirt and turned away, muttering something that might have been an insult but was too quiet to challenge. His friends followed, and Caleb went back to loading his wagon with hands that shook just slightly. "Don't mind them," Pete said quietly, moving to help with the supplies. "Thomas Pratt's been looking for a reason to prove he's as mean as his daddy since he was old enough to walk. Your wife just gave him an excuse to show it. She didn't do anything except save a cow's life. I know that, you know that, but some folks—" Pete shook his head. "Some folks get uncomfortable when the world don't line up with what they expect." Chinese woman showing up Montana ranchers at their own work? That's enough to make certain men feel small, and small men do stupid things. Caleb thought about that on the ride home. The wagon rattled over familiar ruts, the sun beat down on his shoulders, and he turned Pete's words over in his mind. He'd been so focused on his own doubts, what people would think, how it would look, whether he'd made a mistake, that he hadn't considered how Leon's competence might threaten men who measured their worth in what they could do that women supposedly couldn't. When he got back to the ranch, Leon was on the roof of the barn. Caleb's heart jumped into his throat. "What in the hell are you doing up there?" She looked down at him, hammer in hand. "Replacing shingles. The roof leaks." "I can see that, but—" he gestured helplessly. "You could fall. I could also get wet when it rains." She turned back to her work, prying up a damaged shingle with the claw of the hammer. "The angle is not steep. I'm careful. It will be fine." There was no arguing with her when she used that tone. Caleb unloaded the supplies, hyper-aware of Leon's movements above him, half expecting to hear the sound of her falling at any moment. But she worked with the same steady competence she brought to everything, and by the time he'd carried the last sack into the house, she was climbing down the ladder with a satisfied expression. "6 shingles replaced," she announced. "Tomorrow I will do more. In a week, the roof will be sound. You don't have to do all this." "Then who will?" She pulled off her work gloves, a pair of his that were too large for her hands. "You are one man with 300 acres. The work does not stop because you are tired. It does not wait because you need help. It simply is, every day, demanding attention." She looked at him directly. "I told you in town. I did not come here to watch. I came to work." That night, Caleb made a decision. After dinner, while Leon was washing dishes, he cleared his throat. "We should go to the church in Ashford. Make this official." Leon's hand stilled in the dishwater. "You wish to marry me." "We had an agreement. You came all this way. It's only right." "Right." She repeated the word slowly, testing it. "You speak of obligation." "I speak of keeping my word." She turned to face him, drying her hands on a cloth. "Mr. Turner, you are an honest man. This is good, but I will not marry you because it is the right thing to do. If we are to be husband and wife, it should be because we choose it, not because a letter was written, or money was paid, or town gossip demands it." Caleb felt heat rise in his face. "Then what do you want?" "Time." She folded the cloth precisely. "We are strangers who share a house. We work well together. Perhaps that is enough for now. When we know each other better, when we understand what kind of partnership we might build, then we can speak of marriage. People are already calling you my wife. Let them call me what they wish. I am not concerned with what others think, only with what is true." She met his eyes. "Are you?" He wanted to say yes. Wanted to insist that appearances mattered, that reputation had weight, that they needed to formalize things for propriety's sake. But under her steady gaze, those arguments felt flimsy. "No," he admitted. "I suppose I'm not." "Good. Then we agree. We are partners in this work. The rest can wait." But the valley didn't want to wait. Over the following weeks, as summer deepened and the drought showed no signs of breaking, Lion became a subject of intense speculation. Women whispered about her in the mercantile. Men debated her presence at the grain exchange. The Pratts continued spreading poison wherever they could, and while some folks dismissed it as jealousy, others listened with ears that wanted to believe the worst. Leon ignored it all with the same calm she'd shown that first day. She worked the garden, transforming the dead earth through sheer force of will and knowledge that seemed to come from some deep, ancient place. She discovered that the wild mustard greens could tolerate drought better than cultivated vegetables, so she let them spread, creating patches of green in the brown landscape. She found a seep spring half a mile from the house, just a trickle between rocks, and dug a small catchment that could water the garden once a week. The horses responded to her like iron to a lodestone. Even the barn cats, which had been feral and half-starved, began following her around, meowing hopefully. She fed them scraps, and they brought her mice in return, a fair trade that kept the grain stores free of vermin. But it was the incident with Diablo that changed everything. Diablo was a stallion that belonged to Frank Morrison, who ran a horse ranch 10 miles north. The animal had been dangerous from birth. Mean-spirited and violent, prone to kicking and biting anyone who came near. Frank had tried to break him for 2 years and failed. By July, he'd given up entirely. "I'm putting him down tomorrow," Frank told Caleb one afternoon when he stopped by to check on the new calf. "Can't sell him, can't ride him, can't even get close enough to geld him. He's nothing but a liability." They were standing by the corral, watching Lion work with Copper. The mare had become gentle under Leon's patient attention, no longer nervous or prone to biting. "That's a shame," Caleb said. "He's got good bloodlines." "Good bloodlines don't mean squat if you can't get a saddle on him." Frank spat tobacco juice. "I've got a rifle and a hole ready. It's past time." Leon walked over, leading Copper. "You are going to shoot a horse?" "Not your concern, ma'am," Frank said, though he had the grace to tip his hat. "Why?" "Because he's dangerous. Hurt 2 of my hands already. Can't have an animal like that around." Leon handed Copper's lead to Caleb and turned her full attention to Frank. "This horse, he's young?" 4 years old, prime age if he wasn't crazy. Not crazy, frightened. She said it with such certainty that Frank actually blinked. Horses are not born violent, they learn it. Someone hurt him or frightened him badly, and now he trusts no one. "Well, that may be, but bring him here." The words fell into silence. Both men stared at her. "I beg your pardon," Frank said finally. "Bring the stallion here. Let me work with him." "Miss Joe," Caleb started, alarm rising in his chest. "Diablo's killed dogs. He's put men in the hospital. You can't—" "I can try." She looked at Frank. "What do you have to lose? You plan to shoot him anyway. If I fail, he dies. If I succeed, you have a horse worth something again. Where is the risk for you?" Frank looked at Caleb, eyebrows raised. Caleb wanted to say no, wanted to forbid it outright. But he'd seen what Leon could do with damaged things, the garden, the horses, even the house itself. And he'd promised himself he would stop surrendering before trying. "If she wants to attempt it," he said slowly, "it's her choice." "Your funeral," Frank muttered. But 2 days later, he arrived with Diablo. The stallion came in a reinforced trailer, wood planks thick enough to withstand his kicking. Even contained, he was terrifying, a massive bay with a white blaze, eyes rolling, hooves hammering against the walls hard enough to make the whole structure shudder. "Last chance to change your mind," Frank said as they backed the trailer up to the empty corral, the one Caleb used to use for breaking young horses before Margaret died and he'd lost the heart for it. Lion studied the trailer, listening to the violence trapped inside. "How do you usually release him?" "Open the gate and run like hell." "That will not work." She walked around the trailer, examining it from all angles. "He is already afraid. If we add more fear, more chaos, he will only become more dangerous." "Then what do you suggest?" "Everyone leaves except me." "Absolutely not," Caleb said immediately. Leon turned to him. "Mr. Turner, if there are many people, he will feel cornered, threatened. He will attack. But if it is only me, one small person, quiet and still, perhaps he will be curious instead of afraid." "And if he's not curious? If he just kills you?" "Then you will have been right, and I will have been wrong." She said it without drama, just stating a simple fact. "But I do not think that will happen. Animals know intention. They feel it. If I approach with violence in my heart, he will respond with violence. But if I approach with patience," she shrugged, "we will see." Frank looked dubious. Caleb felt sick. But Leon was already moving toward the corral gate, her movements calm and deliberate. "At least let me stay close," Caleb pleaded, "with a rope or a pole, something to distract him if he charges." "No, he will see you as a threat. It must be only me." She opened the corral gate, stepped inside, closed it behind her. Then she turned to face the trailer. "Open it." Caleb and Frank exchanged looks. Every instinct Caleb had was screaming at him to stop this. But Leon's expression was serene, almost meditative. She'd positioned herself in the center of the corral, giving the stallion maximum space, maximum escape routes. Frank pulled the lever that released the trailer gate. Diablo exploded into the corral like a thunderstorm given flesh. He charged out, wheeling immediately, hooves tearing up dirt. When he saw Leon, he stopped, just for a moment, then screamed a challenge that raised the hair on Caleb's neck. The sound was pure rage, pure threat. Leon didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, arms loose at her sides, watching the stallion with the same attention she'd given everything else, waiting. Diablo paced the perimeter of the corral, muscles bunched, ready to attack or flee. His eyes never left Lian. She turned slowly, following his movement, but made no move toward him. Minutes passed. The stallion's pacing became less frantic. His head lowered slightly, still wary, still dangerous, but no longer in full panic. Then Lian did something that made Caleb's heart stop. She sat down, just lowered herself to the dirt and sat cross-legged, her hands resting on her knees, as calm as if she were in a church pew. She didn't look at the stallion directly now, just sat there, breathing slowly, present but unthreatening. Diablo stopped pacing. His ears swiveled forward, confusion replacing rage. This small creature wasn't running, wasn't attacking, wasn't doing anything except existing in the same space, patient as stone. 10 minutes passed. 20. Caleb's legs ached from standing rigid, ready to vault the fence if the stallion charged. But Diablo just stood there, watching Lian with an expression that might have been curiosity. Then, moving with the caution of something approaching a possibly dangerous object, the stallion took one step toward her, then another. Lian remained perfectly still. Diablo stretched out his neck, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Another step, another. He was close enough to strike now, close enough to kill with one well-placed kick. Caleb's hand was on the fence rail, ready to climb over. Rifle be damned. Diablo lowered his massive head and sniffed Lian's hair. She didn't move, barely seemed to breathe. The stallion huffed, his warm breath stirring the loose strands that had escaped her braid. Then, with the delicacy of a hummingbird approaching a flower, he touched his nose to her shoulder. Lian slowly raised one hand. Diablo's head shot up, but he didn't bolt. She moved her hand toward his muzzle with the same careful slowness she'd shown the breech calf, the garden, everything she touched. When her fingers made contact, the stallion trembled but held still. She stroked his nose with long, gentle movements, and Caleb saw the tension drain from the animal's body like water from a broken dam. Diablo's eyes half closed. His breathing slowed. When Lian stood, still moving with that same deliberate care, the stallion followed her like a dog follows its master. She walked him around the corral once, twice, 3 times. By the 4th circuit, she had one hand on his neck, walking beside him as if they'd been partners for years. When she finally led him to the gate, Diablo came willingly, docile as a sheep. Frank's mouth was hanging open. "I'll be damned." Caleb couldn't speak, could barely think. What he'd just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. That horse had been minutes from death, had spent years learning that humans were enemies, and in less than an hour, Lian had undone all of it with nothing but patience and stillness. She brought Diablo to the fence where the men stood. The stallion's eyes were calm now, curious. He sniffed at Frank without aggression, then turned his attention back to Lian as if seeking reassurance that this was acceptable. "He will need time," Lian said, stroking the stallion's neck. "Weeks, maybe months, but he can be ridden. He can be trusted. He only needed someone to trust him first." Frank looked at his horse, his dangerous, violent, unsellable horse, standing quiet and gentle under Lian's hand. "How much would you charge to finish his training?" "Nothing." "Ma'am, keep him here. Let me work with him. When he is ready, take him home. No charge." "But that could take months. Feed, space, your time. Consider it payment for not shooting him." She said it simply, without judgment. He deserves a chance to be what he was meant to be, not what fear made him. Word of what happened with Diablo spread even faster than news of the calf. Within a week, 3 other ranchers showed up with difficult horses, asking if the Chinese woman might work her magic on them too. Lian accepted each one, setting up a rotation so she could give attention to all of them. The corral that had stood empty for 3 years became busy again, filled with horses learning to trust. But not everyone was pleased. The Pratts watched this development with expressions that grew darker by the day. Sam Pratt, in particular, seemed to take Lian's success as a personal insult. He started making the rounds in Ashford, asking pointed questions about mail-order brides and immigration laws. He bought drinks at the saloon and talked loudly about the proper way of things, about standards and traditions, and what happened when you let foreigners get ideas above their station. Most people ignored him, but some listened. Caleb heard the rumblings and felt unease curl in his stomach. He tried to talk to Leon about it one evening while they were feeding the horses. "The Pratts are causing trouble," he said, "spreading talk. I'm worried they might try something." "Let them try." Leon measured out grain with her usual precision. "Words cannot hurt me. It's not just words I'm worried about. Sam Pratt's mean, and his sons are worse. If they decide to make a move, then we will deal with it when it happens." She poured grain into the trough, and Copper immediately came over to eat, nuzzling Leon's shoulder affectionately. "I did not come here expecting everyone to accept me. I came here to work, to build something. What the Pratts think about that is their concern, not mine." But 3 nights later, Caleb woke to the smell of smoke. He was on his feet instantly, heart hammering. Through the window, he could see orange light flickering, not from the house, but from the direction of the barn. He grabbed his boots, his rifle, and was out the door before his mind fully caught up with what was happening. The barn was on fire. Not the whole structure, not yet, but flames were climbing up the north wall, feeding on the dry wood with hungry enthusiasm. Inside, the horses were screaming. Leon appeared beside him, already dressed, her face illuminated by the fire's glow. "The well," she said, her voice cutting through his panic with sharp clarity. "Get water. I will get the horses." "No, I'll get them." But she was already running toward the barn, and there was no time to argue. Caleb sprinted for the well, grabbing the buckets they kept there, hauling up water with arms that shook with adrenaline and fear. By the time he turned back, Leon had thrown open the barn doors. Smoke poured out in a thick black cloud. The horses' screams intensified. Caleb ran toward the barn with sloshing buckets, but before he could reach the flames, Leon emerged leading Copper and 2 other horses. Their eyes were rolling white with terror, but they followed her, trusting her even through their panic. "The rest?" Caleb shouted. "Going back!" She thrust the leads into his hands and disappeared into the smoke again. Caleb tied the horses to the corral fence and threw his water on the flames. It was like spitting on a wildfire, but he did it anyway, then ran back for more. By the time he returned, Leon had brought out 2 more horses. She was coughing, her face smeared with soot, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Diablo," she gasped. "Still inside, scared, won't come." Caleb thrust the buckets at her and grabbed a blanket from the corral fence. "I'll get him. You keep fighting the fire." He soaked the blanket in the horse trough and threw it over his head and shoulders. The barn interior was an inferno of smoke and flickering shadows. He could hear Diablo at the far end screaming his fear and rage, hooves battering against the stall door. The stallion had regressed in his terror, back to the violent animal he'd been before Leon's patient work. Caleb fumbled with the stall latch, threw it open. Diablo reared, hooves flashing, and Caleb barely dodged. "Easy, boy, easy." But the horse was beyond hearing, beyond reason. He charged past Caleb toward the barn doors, but flames blocked the way. He wheeled, trapped and panicking, looking for any escape. Then Leanne's voice cut through the chaos. She was singing. Caleb couldn't understand the words. They were Chinese, a melody that rose and fell with the strange tonal quality of her native language. But Diablo's ears swiveled toward the sound. His rearing slowed. Leon appeared in the doorway, still singing that haunting song, and the stallion turned toward her like a compass finding north. She backed toward the exit, still singing, and Diablo followed. Step by step, she led him through the smoke and flames, her voice never wavering, until they were all outside in the cool night air. Together, they fought the fire. Leanne and Caleb hauling water in a desperate relay while the barn burned. But the well was getting low, each bucket taking longer to fill, and the flames kept spreading despite their efforts. Just when Caleb thought they'd lost everything, he saw lights in the distance. Wagons. 3 of them, coming fast. Frank Morrison arrived first, his sons with him, all carrying buckets and burlap sacks. Then Martha Henderson and her husband. Then others, neighbors Caleb barely knew, people from town who'd heard the glow of fire and come to help. They formed a bucket line from the well to the barn, passing water hand to hand, working with the efficient desperation of people who knew that fire respected no boundaries. If the Turner Ranch burned, the next one might be theirs. It took 2 hours to contain the blaze. By the time the last ember was drowned, the barn's north wall was gone, and part of the roof had collapsed. But 3/4 of the structure remained standing, and all the horses were safe. Caleb sat in the dirt, exhausted beyond words, watching smoke curl up into the pre-dawn sky. Leanne was beside him, equally filthy and spent. Around them, their neighbors were packing up, preparing to leave. Frank Morrison approached, his face grim. "Found something you need to see." He led them to the base of the north wall, where the fire had started. In the ash and debris, partially burned but still recognizable, was a kerosene-soaked rag tied to a stick. "Someone did this on purpose," Frank said quietly. Said it deliberate. Caleb felt rage rise in his chest, hot and murderous. "The Pratts." "Probably. But can you prove it?" "I know it was them." "Knowing and proving are different things." Frank kicked at the debris. "You could ride over there, make accusations, might even be right. But unless you caught them in the act, it's just your word against theirs. And the sheriff," he shook his head, "the sheriff's not likely to take your side. Not over this." Leanne touched Caleb's arm. "Let it go." "Let it go?" He turned to her, disbelief sharp in his voice. "They tried to burn us out. They could have killed the horses. Killed us. And you want me to just let it go?" "I want you to think." Her voice was steady, reasonable. "What happens if you ride to the Pratt's ranch? You fight. Maybe you win. Maybe you lose. Either way, it solves nothing. They will still hate us. The valley will still be divided. And we will have wasted energy on revenge that could be used for rebuilding. So we do nothing? We do what we always do." She looked at the damaged barn, then back at him. "We work. We rebuild. We show them that we cannot be destroyed by fire or fear or hate. That is the only revenge that matters." Caleb wanted to argue. Every fiber of his being wanted to ride to the Pratt ranch and make them pay. But he looked at the neighbors who'd come to help fight the fire, at Frank Morrison standing there with soot on his face, at the barn that could have been destroyed but wasn't, and he understood what Lion was really saying. The valley was watching, not just the Pratts, but everyone. How Caleb and Lion responded to this would tell people who they were. If they chose violence, they'd confirm every dark suspicion. But if they chose rebuilding, "All right," he said finally, the word tasting like ash. "All right, we rebuild." Over the next week, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who'd never spoken to them before started arriving with materials: spare lumber, extra shingles, nails, tools. Frank Morrison came every day to help with the reconstruction. Even Martha Henderson showed up with food, claiming she'd cooked too much and didn't want it to go to waste. The barn rose again, stronger than before. But more than the barn was being built. Caleb watched Leanne work alongside their neighbors, saw how she thanked each person with the same careful courtesy, how she shared water and food without hesitation, how she asked about their families and remembered the details. She was building something more valuable than walls and roof beams. She was building community. Still, the Pratts remained a dark presence on the edge of everything. They didn't help with the barn, didn't acknowledge what had happened, just watched from a distance with expressions that promised this wasn't over. And the drought continued, pressing down on the valley like a hand slowly closing into a fist. The well was getting dangerously low now. Caleb knew they had maybe 2 weeks of water left, 3 if they were very careful. After that, he tried not to think about after that. But late one night, unable to sleep, he found Leanne standing outside looking toward the mountains. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Thinking about water." She didn't turn, just kept her eyes on the distant peaks. "The snow is there. The water is there. It has not vanished. It only moves through channels we cannot see." "Underground rivers," Caleb said. "My father used to talk about them. Said there were streams running through rock all through these mountains, deep enough that wells couldn't reach them. But they can be reached." Leanne turned to him now. "In my grandfather's village, when the drought came, they would listen to the land, put their ears to the ground, follow the paths of old growth trees because trees remember where the deep water runs. They would dig where the land whispered." "That's superstition." "Is it?" She tilted her head. "Or is it knowledge we have forgotten how to hear?" Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd tamed a violent stallion with patience, who'd saved a dying calf, who'd transformed dead earth into living garden, who'd come to his ranch with nothing but a battered trunk and belief that broken things could be whole again. "Where would you dig?" he asked. Lian smiled, and in the moonlight, it looked like hope. Tomorrow I will show you. The next morning, Lian was up before dawn, moving through the half-light with purpose. Caleb found her at the edge of the property, walking slowly along the fence line that marked the boundary between his land and the rocky ridge to the north. She'd stop every few yards, tilt her head as if listening to something only she could hear, then move on. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Looking for signs." She knelt beside a cluster of scrub oak, twisted, stubborn things that somehow survived despite the drought. "These trees are old. Their roots go deep, 50 feet, maybe more. They would not survive on surface water alone." Caleb looked at the gnarled oaks with new eyes. He'd never paid them much attention before. They were just part of the landscape, tough and unremarkable. But Lian was right. While everything else had turned brown and brittle, these trees remained alive, their leaves dusty but green. "So you think there's water under them?" "I think water exists somewhere beneath us. The question is where it runs closest to the surface." She moved along the ridge, examining the ground with intense focus. Every so often she'd kneel, press her palm flat against the earth, close her eyes as if feeling for something Caleb couldn't perceive. They spent the morning like that, Lian searching while Caleb followed, growing more skeptical with each passing hour. This was madness. You couldn't find water by listening to trees and touching dirt. Water required proper surveying, drilling equipment, geological knowledge, not intuition and old village superstitions. But then Lian stopped at a spot where the ridge formed a slight depression, a shallow bowl in the rock where rainwater might once have collected. 3 ancient oaks grew there in a rough triangle, their branches intertwined overhead. The ground beneath was different from the surrounding area, darker soil, different vegetation. Even the rocks looked different, rounded and smooth, as if water had shaped them over centuries. "Here," Lian said, and her voice carried absolute certainty. "The water runs here." Caleb looked at the spot. It didn't seem special, just another patch of drought-stricken land among hundreds of acres of the same. "How can you be sure?" "I cannot be sure. Not until we dig. But this place, she gestured around the depression. "The trees position themselves in a pattern. The soil holds moisture longer. See how it is darker? The rocks are smooth from old water flow. And if you are very quiet, very still, you can feel it. The earth is cooler here. The air moves differently." "That could be just wind patterns, shade from the trees." "It could be." She met his eyes. "Or it could be water. 30 feet down, maybe 40. Running through channels in the rock, too deep for your well, but not too deep to reach if we are willing to work for it." Caleb wanted to believe her, wanted it so badly that it scared him, but wanting didn't make something true. "Lian, I can't afford to waste time and energy digging in the wrong place. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. Get someone who knows what they're doing, someone who will charge you money you do not have to drill holes that may find nothing." She said it gently but firmly. "How much would that cost?" He didn't answer because they both knew. More than he could spare. Probably more than the ranch was worth at this point. "This will cost us only labor," Lian continued. "Sweat and time. If I'm wrong, we have lost days. If I am right..." She looked back at the depression, at the ancient oaks standing guard. "If I am right, we save everything." That afternoon, Caleb brought tools to the ridge, picks, shovels, pry bars. The ground was hard, a mixture of soil and rock that resisted the shovel like iron. Within an hour, his shoulders were burning. Within 2, his hands were bleeding despite his gloves. They'd managed to dig down maybe 3 feet, and every inch was agony. "This is impossible," he said, leaning on his shovel, sweat pouring down his face despite the dry heat. "We'll never get through this." "Not impossible, only difficult." Lian attacked the earth with short, controlled strikes, maximizing efficiency. "In my village, we had a saying, the mountain does not move, so we must become water and flow around it. But when there is no way around, we become the mountain instead. Patient, persistent, unmovable." Your village had a lot of sayings. My village had a lot of droughts. She didn't slow her rhythm, didn't waste energy on unnecessary movement. We learned to dig, or we learned to die. I prefer digging. They worked until dark, then stumbled back to the house too exhausted to speak. Caleb's whole body screamed. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with a hammer. He collapsed onto his bedroll fully clothed, certain he'd never move again. But when dawn came, Leanne was already up, making breakfast, moving with the same steady efficiency despite her own exhaustion. "We continue today," she said, setting a plate of eggs and the last of their bacon in front of him. "Every foot we dig brings us closer." Closer to water or closer to admitting this was a mistake? We will find out together. The second day was worse than the first. They hit a layer of granite that required the pry bar and pickaxe, chipping away fragments of stone with strikes that sent shocks up Caleb's arms. By noon, they'd advanced maybe 6 inches. By evening, perhaps a foot. The hole was becoming deeper, the work more difficult as they had to haul dirt and rock up from increasing depths. Frank Morrison rode by on the third day, stopped to watch them working. "What in the hell are you doing?" he called down. "Digging a well," Caleb grunted, swinging the pickaxe. "There, on the ridge?" Frank shook his head. "Caleb, that's fool's work. Rock's too thick up here. You need to drill if you want water from this elevation." "We do not need to drill," Leanne said, not pausing in her shoveling. "Only to dig far enough." "Ma'am, with all respect, you're wasting your time. I've ranched this valley for 20 years. Nobody's ever found water on that ridge." "Then we will be the first." She smiled up at him, dirt streaking her face. "Or we will be fools. Either way, we must try." Frank looked at Caleb with something like pity. "You're letting her run things now?" "She saved your horse," Caleb reminded him. "Seems like her judgment's been pretty sound so far." After Frank left, shaking his head at the madness, Caleb and Leanne kept digging. 5 feet down, 7, 10. The walls of the hole became steep, requiring one person to dig while the other hauled up buckets of dirt and stone. It was slow, brutal work that made the barn raising seem easy by comparison. On the 4th day, the Pratt brothers rode up. Sam sat his horse at the edge of the excavation, looking down at Caleb and Leanne with unconcealed contempt. "Heard you two were digging for water," Sam said. "Thought we'd come to see the spectacle." Caleb climbed out of the hole, his muscles protesting every movement. "Nothing spectacular about it, just work." "Foolish work." Daniel spat over the edge of the hole, narrowly missing Leanne. "You're going to kill yourself for nothing. That Chinaman's filled your head with nonsense." "Her name is Leanne," Caleb said, his voice going cold. "And the only nonsense around here is coming from your mouth." "Careful, Turner." Sam leaned forward in his saddle. "You're already on thin ice with this valley. Bringing in foreign help, letting her make decisions, digging holes in the ground like a dog after a bone. People are starting to wonder if you've lost your mind. Let them wonder." Caleb picked up his shovel, a clear dismissal. "We've got work to do." "You've got failure ahead of you is what you've got," Daniel said. "And when this little project collapses, and it will, don't come crying to us for help." They rode off laughing, and Caleb felt the old rage kindle in his chest. But when he looked down into the hole, Leanne was still working, unbothered by the Pratt's presence or their poison. She caught his eye and shrugged. "They are afraid," she said simply. "Afraid? Of what?" "That we might succeed." She drove her shovel into the stubborn earth. "Because if we succeed where they have failed, it makes them small, and small men cannot bear to be made smaller." On the 5th day, they hit 15 feet and found nothing but more rock. Caleb's hands were raw despite the gloves, his back a constant ache. That night, he sat at the table with his head in his hands, doubt crushing down on him like the weight of all that stone. "We should stop," he said. "This isn't working." Leanne was at the stove, heating water for washing. She didn't turn around. "Why?" "Because we've been digging for 5 days and found nothing. Because the well at the house is down to maybe a week of water. Because if we keep wasting time here, we won't have the strength to do what we really need to do, pack up and leave before we die of thirst." Now she did turn, studying him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You want to leave. I want to survive. And this?" He gestured toward the ridge, toward the hole that had consumed their days. "This is madness. Your grandfather's superstitions about listening to the land. I'm sorry, Leanne, but it's not enough. We need real water, not hope and good intentions." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "My grandfather died of thirst. Did I tell you that?" "You mentioned it, yes. What I did not tell you was how." She poured the hot water into a basin, added cold from their dwindling bucket. The drought came in spring. By summer, the village well was dry. The men dug new wells, deeper wells, but found nothing. One by one, families left for the cities. But my grandfather refused. He believed the water was still there, underground, waiting to be found. He studied the land, watched where the insects went, where the old trees grew. And finally, he chose a place to dig. Did he find water? No. He dug for 3 weeks and found only rock. The effort killed him. His heart gave out in the heat. The villagers buried him in the hole he had made, said he was a fool who died for stubbornness. She washed her hands slowly, deliberately. But 2 months later, a merchant traveling through the village hired workers to finish my grandfather's well, 20 feet deeper than my grandfather had managed. And at 23 feet, they struck water, an underground stream that still flows today, that saved the village when the rains finally came. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. Lian, my grandfather was right, she continued, but he did not have enough time, enough help, enough strength to finish what he started. So the village remembered him as a fool instead of a visionary. She turned to face Caleb fully. I cannot tell you with certainty that there is water in that hole. I can only tell you what the land suggests, what the trees and rocks and soil whisper. But I know this. If we stop now, we will never know if we were 3 feet away or 30. We will leave, and someone else may come after us, finish what we started, find the water we needed. And they will tell stories about the fools who gave up too soon. She crossed to where he sat, knelt so they were eye level. Her hands, calloused and scarred from work, took his. I did not come here to quit at the first hardship, she said, or the 10th, or the 100th. I came here to build something that lasts, to prove that broken things can be whole, that dead earth can live again, that water exists even when we cannot see it. If you want to leave, I will not stop you, but I'm going to keep digging because I would rather die trying than live knowing I surrendered before the work was done. Caleb looked at her, this small woman with dirt under her fingernails and hope in her eyes, who'd traveled across an ocean and half a continent to answer a desperate letter from a stranger, who'd saved his cattle, tamed his horses, transformed his dying ranch through sheer refusal to accept defeat, who was asking him now to have the same faith in possibility that she carried in her bones. All right, he said, and felt something shift inside him, like a foundation settling into bedrock. We keep digging. The 6th day dawned hot and merciless. They descended into the hole before the sun was fully up, attacking the stone with renewed determination. Caleb's shoulders screamed with every swing of the pickaxe. Lian worked the shovel, clearing debris as he broke it loose, their rhythm synchronized through days of shared labor. 18 feet down. 20. The air in the hole was stifling, and they had to take frequent breaks to haul themselves up for fresh air and water. The work became meditation, hypnotic in its repetition. Swing, chip, shovel, haul. Swing, chip, shovel, haul. The world narrowed to rock and heat and the ache in every muscle. 22 feet, 23. Caleb was swinging the pickaxe more on reflex than conscious thought, when his strike hit something different. Not the solid resistance of granite, but something with give. The pick point sank deeper than expected, and when he pulled it free, water trickled from the hole it had made. He froze, staring at the trickle, his exhausted brain struggling to process what he was seeing. Lian. She looked up from where she was shoveling, followed his gaze, went absolutely still. Water was seeping through the crack his pickaxe had made, darkening the stone, collecting in the bottom of the hole in a small, growing pool. Again, Lian whispered. Strike again. Caleb swung with every ounce of strength he had left. The pick bit into the rock, and this time the crack widened. Water began flowing more steadily, cold and clear, bubbling up from somewhere deep in the earth. Again! He struck a 3rd time, and the rock face gave way. Water erupted from the opening like a geyser, spraying them both, flooding the bottom of the hole with shocking speed. They scrambled up the rope they'd rigged for climbing, hauling themselves out just as the water level rose past where they'd been standing. They lay on the ground beside the hole, gasping, soaked to the skin, while water poured from the opening they'd created. It bubbled and frothed, spreading across the depression, finding old channels and carving new ones. Within minutes, the dry bowl where the ancient oak stood was transforming into a shallow pond. Caleb started laughing. He couldn't help it. The sound burst from him wild and disbelieving, bordering on hysteria. They'd done it. 7 days of brutal, back-breaking labor that everyone said was impossible, and they'd done it. Leon was laughing too, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She grabbed Caleb's hand, squeezing tight, and together they watched their miracle fill the depression with life-giving water. 23 feet, Caleb managed between gasps of laughter. Same depth as your grandfather's well. He would have liked you, Leon said, wiping her eyes, stubborn enough to keep digging even when you thought it was hopeless. I learned from the best. They sat there until their breathing returned to normal, until the reality of what they'd accomplished fully sank in. Water. Real, flowing water that showed no sign of stopping, enough to sustain the ranch through the drought and beyond. We need to channel it, Leon said finally, her practical mind already moving forward. Build a pipe or a trough to bring it down to the house and barn. Create a proper well structure so nothing contaminates it. And we should build a cistern to store overflow. Tomorrow, Caleb interrupted. Tomorrow, we'll do all that. Today, we're going to sit here and watch our water flow. So they did. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, they sat beside their well and watched the depression fill. Birds that hadn't been seen in months appeared, drawn by the sound and scent of water. Insects skated across the surface. The ancient oak seemed to straighten slightly, as if sensing relief was at hand. By afternoon, word had spread. Frank Morrison was the first to arrive, his jaw actually dropping when he saw water flowing freely where none had existed before. I'll be damned, he breathed. You actually found it. Leon found it, Caleb corrected. I just provided the muscle. However you did it. Frank shook his head in wonder. This is going to change things. You know that, right? You've got water when the rest of the valley is dying of thirst. Others came throughout the day. Martha Henderson and her husband, the Sanchez family from the South Ridge. Even Reverend Michaels, who stood at the edge of the new pond and blessed it with words about faith, rewarded, and miracles in the wilderness. Not everyone who came was friendly. Some arrived with hard eyes and calculating expressions, clearly wondering how they could access this sudden abundance. Caleb could read the thoughts on their faces. If the Turners had water, didn't the community have a right to share it? Wasn't it selfish to hoard such a resource during drought? The Pratts arrived near sunset, all three of them, Sam, Daniel, and young Thomas. They sat their horses at the edge of the property, staring at the water with expressions that cycled through disbelief, anger, and something darker. Guess the Chinaman got lucky, Sam said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Caleb felt Leon stiffen beside him. He started to stand to confront them, but her hand on his arm stopped him. Let them talk, she murmured. Words cannot take this away from us. Sam's voice grew louder, playing to the small crowd that had gathered. Of course, finding water on your land when everyone else is suffering, some might call that selfish, some might say a good neighbor would share. We plan to share, Caleb said, keeping his voice level. Anyone who needs water for their stock, for drinking, they're welcome to it. We're not going to let animals or people die of thirst. How generous, Sam's tone dripped with sarcasm. Though I seem to recall you weren't so generous when we offered our thoughts about your hiring practices. Funny how you want community cooperation now that you've got something we need. What we need, Leon said, standing up, is for you to stop talking and start listening. The water is here. It flows for everyone. But respect goes both ways. You come with empty buckets and honest need, they will be filled. You come with threats and bitterness, you will leave the same way you arrived, empty. Thomas Pratt laughed, the sound ugly. Listen to her, giving orders like she owns the place. She does own it, Caleb said quietly, and felt the truth of the words even as he spoke them. This is her land as much as mine, her water as much as mine. She found it, dug for it, bled for it. So yes, she gets to say who uses it and how. The Pratts exchanged looks that promised this wasn't over, but they rode away without further comment, and the tension that had gripped the gathered neighbors eased slightly. That night, after everyone had gone home and the last of the daylight had faded, Caleb and Leon sat by their well listening to the water flow. The sound was hypnotic, peaceful in a way Caleb hadn't experienced in years. "You told them I own this place," Leon said softly. "Did I? You know you did." She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "We are not married. I have no legal claim to this land." "Maybe we should fix that." She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight her expression was unreadable. "You asked me before. I said we should wait. That was before we dug through 23 feet of rock together. Before you saved my barn and my horses, and probably my life. Before you proved that the impossible is just the difficult wearing a scary mask." He shifted to face her fully. "I'm not asking because it's proper or because the town expects it. I'm asking because we're partners, real partners. And I want to make that official." "Caleb Turner," she said, and there was something warm in her voice, something he'd never heard before. "Are you proposing marriage while covered in mud beside a hole in the ground?" "I am. Is that a problem?" "It is not romantic. It's honest." He reached for her hand, found it. "Leon Joe, will you marry me? Not because a letter was written or money was paid, but because we built something together that neither of us could have built alone?" She was quiet for so long that Caleb's heart began to sink. Then she squeezed his hand, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, because you kept digging even when you thought it was hopeless. Because you trusted me when everyone said I was wrong. Because you see me as a partner, not a possession." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And because somewhere in all this work and dust and stubbornness, I started to love you." Caleb felt something break open in his chest, something that had been frozen since Margaret died. It wasn't the same love he'd had before, that had been young and easy, built on dreams and optimism. This was harder earned, forged in adversity and mutual respect. It was love that came from seeing someone at their worst and choosing them anyway. From digging through rock together and finding water at the end. "I love you too," he said, and meant it with every scarred, exhausted part of himself. They sat there beside their miracle well until the stars came out in force, holding hands like teenagers, making quiet plans for the future. They channeled the water down to the house by week's end, build a proper cistern, expand the garden now that they had reliable irrigation, maybe even get those chickens Lion kept mentioning. And yes, they'd share the water with their neighbors. Not because they had to, but because it was right. Because surviving a drought alone was just existing, but surviving it together was living. The well changed everything, but not in the ways Caleb expected. The water itself was transformative. Within days, the garden exploded with new growth as Leanne redirected flow through irrigation channels she dug with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. The horses grew sleek and healthy. The cattle stopped looking ribby and desperate, but it was the human response that proved most complicated. True to their word, Caleb and Leon allowed neighbors to water their stock at the new well. They established a schedule to prevent overcrowding and asked only that people bring their own containers and respect the space. Most came with gratitude, even those who'd been skeptical before. Frank Morrison brought a side of beef as thanks. Martha Henderson traded water access for preserves and bread. The Sanchez family offered to help dig additional channels. But the Pratts never came. Not to water their stock, not to ask for help, not even to acknowledge the well's existence. Caleb heard through Frank that their herd was suffering badly, that they'd lost several cattle already and more were failing. Yet Sam Pratt's pride apparently ran deeper than his concern for his animals. "Let them suffer," Frank said one afternoon while watering his horses. "Sam Pratt's been mean-spirited his whole life. Maybe this'll teach him some humility." But that night, Caleb found Lion standing at the fence, looking toward the Pratt ranch in the distance. "They have not come for water," she said. "No, and they won't. Sam's too proud." "Pride does not keep cattle alive." She turned to him. "Their animals are dying?" "That's what I hear." "Then we must bring them water." Caleb stared at her. "You can't be serious. After everything they've done, the fire, the insults, the constant harassment." "I am very serious." Her expression was calm, resolved. "The cattle did not set the fire. The cattle did not call me names. They are innocent, and they are suffering. We have water. They need water. It is simple." "It's not simple at all. The Pratts will see it as weakness. Or worse, as charity they'll resent even more than they resent our success." Then let them resent it. Lian's voice was quiet but firm. I did not dig through rock to save only the people who like me. I did it to save the land. All of it. Including the parts owned by mean, stubborn men who would rather watch their animals die than accept help from someone they consider beneath them. Lian, tomorrow we load the wagon with water barrels. We drive to the Pratt Ranch. We offer them water for their cattle. What they do with that offer is their choice, but we will make it because it is right. She walked back toward the house, leaving Caleb standing by the fence, torn between admiration and exasperation. This woman would drive him to an early grave with her uncompromising morality, but she was right. Damn it, she was right. The next morning they loaded 6 barrels of water into the wagon and drove toward the Pratt Ranch. The road was dusty and rutted, the landscape growing more desolate as they climbed into the hills where the Pratts had their spread. When they finally arrived, the devastation was worse than Caleb had imagined. Dead cattle lay in the fields, their carcasses already picked over by scavengers. The living ones were gaunt, their ribs showing through dull hides, eyes glazed with thirst and suffering. The ranch buildings looked abandoned, though Caleb knew the Pratts were there somewhere, watching. He pulled the wagon up to the main house. Before he could call out, Sam Pratt emerged, his face twisted with rage. "Get off my property!" "We brought water," Caleb said. "For your stock. No charge, no strings, just water." "I don't want your goddamn water." Sam's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. "And I don't want your goddamn pity." "This is not pity," Lian said from beside Caleb. "This is neighborly kindness. Your cattle are dying. We can prevent that. Please, let us help." "Help?" Sam spat the word like poison. "You think I need help from a Chinaman's whore? You think I'm going to let you come onto my land, into my life, and that's enough." Caleb's voice cut through Sam's tirade like a blade. "You don't have to like us. You don't have to accept our help. But you will not talk to my wife that way. Not now, not ever." "Your wife?" Sam laughed, the sound bitter and ugly. "That what you're calling it? Because the way I see it..." A gunshot cracked through the air. Everyone froze. Daniel Pratt stood in the doorway of the barn, rifle still smoking. "Pa," he said quietly. "Let them leave the water." Sam whirled on his son. "What did you say?" "I said let them leave the water. I'm done watching our herd die because you're too proud to accept help. We can hate them all we want after the drought breaks. But right now, I'm choosing to save our cattle over your ego." The silence that followed was absolute. Sam's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, betrayal, before settling into something cold and hard. "You take their water," he said to Daniel, "and you're no son of mine." "Then I guess I'm not your son." Daniel walked toward the wagon, not looking at his father. "Where do you want these barrels?" They unloaded the water in tense silence, Sam watching from the porch with murder in his eyes, while Daniel and Thomas helped carry the barrels to the water troughs. The cattle smelled the water immediately and came at a stumbling run, pushing and jostling to reach the troughs. The sound of them drinking, desperate, grateful, filled the air. When the last barrel was empty, Daniel stood before Caleb and Lian, his hat in his hands. "Thank you," he said simply. "For this, for not being as small as we've been." "Water is water," Lian replied. "It does not care who drinks it or why. It only cares about giving life." As they drove away, Caleb looked back to see Sam Pratt still standing on his porch, alone and rigid. But in the field, Daniel and Thomas were among the cattle, checking them over, their relief visible even from a distance. "You made an enemy of Sam Pratt for life," Caleb said. "I already was his enemy." Lian watched the landscape roll past. "But perhaps I made friends of his sons. Sometimes that is enough." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Ashford, with Reverend Michaels presiding and half the valley in attendance. Leah wore a dress that Martha Henderson had helped her make, cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery along the collar, a compromise between American tradition and Chinese sensibility. Caleb wore his Sunday best, hair slicked back, boots polished for the first time in months. Frank Morrison stood as witness, and Martha cried genuine tears when Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto Lian's finger. The ring had been his mother's, kept in a drawer for years, waiting for the right moment. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for Lan's small, work-hardened hand. The Pratts didn't come. Neither did several other families who'd made their feelings about the marriage clear through pointed absence. But enough people filled the pews that the church felt warm and full, and when Caleb kissed his bride, chaste and brief as propriety demanded, the applause was genuine. The reception was held at the Turner Ranch, tables set up in the yard beneath strings of lanterns that Frank's wife had donated. People brought food, more food than Caleb had seen in one place since before the drought. Roasted chicken and beef, fresh bread, preserves, pies made from the first fruits starting to ripen now that water flowed freely again. It was abundance after scarcity, celebration after survival, and it tasted like hope. Daniel Pratt showed up late, alone, carrying a bottle of whiskey wrapped in brown paper. He found Caleb near the barn, away from the crowd. "Didn't know if I'd be welcome," Daniel said, offering the bottle. "But I wanted to come. Wanted to say congratulations proper-like." Caleb took the whiskey, studying the younger man's face. Daniel had his father's build, but not his meanness. There was something uncertain in his expression, like a man standing at a crossroads trying to decide which direction led away from poison. "You're welcome here," Caleb said. "You and Thomas both. Whatever's between me and your father, that doesn't have to be between us. Pa's not speaking to me, hasn't said a word since you brought that water. Thomas is caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace." Daniel scuffed his boot in the dirt. "I don't know how long I can stay there. Every day feels like choosing between my father and my conscience, and I'm tired of choosing wrong." "There's always work for a good hand," Caleb said carefully. "If you're looking." Daniel's head came up, surprise clear on his face. "You'd hire me? After everything my family's done?" "You're not your family. You proved that when you stood up to your father." Caleb extended his hand. "But I won't lie to you. It won't be easy. People will talk. Your father will likely see it as betrayal. You need to be sure." Daniel looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then gripped it firmly. "I'm sure. Been sure since I watched our cattle drink the water you had every right to keep to yourself. A man who does that kind of thing, who repays meanness with mercy, that's the kind of man worth working for." They shook, and something shifted in the valley's balance. Not much. Not enough to change everything, but enough to matter. Inside the celebration, Leon was surrounded by women. Martha Henderson had her cornered, insisting she needed to know the secret to making the garden grow so lush. Mrs. Sanchez wanted advice about a mare having trouble with her foal. Even Widow Shelby, who'd been among the most skeptical when Lan first arrived, was asking questions about Chinese remedies for arthritis. Caleb watched his wife navigate the attention with the same grace she brought to everything. She answered questions patiently, offered advice freely, and somehow made each woman feel heard and valued. This was her gift, he realized. Not just knowledge or skill, though she had both in abundance. It was the ability to see what was needed and provide it without making the giving feel like charity. The party lasted until well past dark, lantern light spilling across the yard while Frank's oldest boy played fiddle and people danced. Caleb claimed his bride for a turn around the makeshift dance floor, really just packed earth near the barn, and they swayed together while the music played and the stars came out. "Happy?" he asked, his hand warm on her waist. "Very happy." She smiled up at him. "Though I think Martha Henderson has asked me to teach her Chinese cooking at least 5 times tonight." "You gonna do it?" "Of course. Knowledge shared is knowledge that grows." She rested her head against his chest. "Besides, the more people know about my culture, the less they can fear it. Fear comes from ignorance. Understanding comes from breaking bread together." After the last guest departed and the lanterns were extinguished, Caleb and Leon stood together in the quiet, looking at their ranch. The barn, rebuilt and strong. The house, clean and welcoming with actual curtains in the windows now. The garden, lush and green even in drought conditions. The well on the ridge, its water flowing steadily down through channels they'd carved, bringing life to everything it touched. "We did this," Caleb said softly. "Together." "Yes, together." Leon took his hand. "And tomorrow we do more. Always more. That is what building a life means." That night, for the first time, they shared the bedroom not as strangers sharing a house, but as husband and wife. And if the drought still pressed down on the valley beyond their property, if enemies still lurked in the shadows nursing their resentment, those concerns felt distant and manageable. They had water. They had each other. The rest would come. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Daniel Pratt joined them as a hired hand, bringing muscle and surprising skill with horses. Together, the three of them expanded the irrigation system, channeling water to portions of the ranch that had been barren for years. Grass began to grow again. The cattle multiplied. Leanne's saved calf, now a healthy heifer, almost ready for breeding herself. Other ranchers came to study their water system, to ask advice, to learn how Leanne had found water where professional drillers had said none existed. She shared everything freely, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining about root systems and rock formations, and the old knowledge passed down through generations of Chinese farmers who'd survived drought after drought. Some listened with genuine interest. Others came with skepticism barely concealed, as if hoping to find some trick or fraud they could expose. But the water kept flowing, undeniable and pure. And even the skeptics had to acknowledge that something remarkable had happened on the Turner Ranch. The garden became legendary. Travelers passing through Ashford would detour just to see the Chinese woman's miracle vegetables. Tomatoes the size of a man's fist, squash that took 2 hands to lift, beans hanging in abundant clusters. Leanne had created a system of companion planting based on techniques from her village, where each crop supported the others, creating an ecosystem that required less water and produced more food than conventional farming. Martha Henderson convinced Leanne to teach a class at the church about water conservation and drought-resistant gardening. 20 women showed up, notebooks in hand, ready to learn. Leanne stood before them, this foreign woman who'd arrived less than 6 months ago, and taught them secrets that had sustained her people through famines and droughts that would have destroyed less resilient cultures. Water is precious, she told them, so you must use it with wisdom. Plant things together that help each other. Beans feed nitrogen to the soil for the tomatoes. Marigolds keep the insects away from the squash. Everything has a purpose. Everything connects. When you understand these connections, you work with nature instead of against it, and nature rewards those who listen. The women listened. Some because they were desperate, others because they were curious, a few because they genuinely wanted to understand. But they all learned, and within weeks, gardens across the valley began to transform. Not as dramatically as Leanne's. That took years of practice and intuition she was still developing herself, but enough to make a difference. Enough to feed families that had been relying on expensive canned goods from the mercantile. But not everyone was pleased with Leanne's growing influence. Sam Pratt watched his son work the Turner Ranch and seethed with resentment that grew more poisonous with each passing day. He'd lost face when Daniel defied him, lost respect when his cattle nearly died while the Turners prospered. And now, with half the valley seeking advice from the Chinese woman he'd tried to run off, Sam's bitterness reached a critical mass. It came to a head in late August, at the grain exchange in Ashford. Caleb had gone to sell some surplus hay, the first surplus they'd had in 3 years, thanks to irrigated pastures. Sam was there with Thomas, and the moment Caleb walked in, Sam's voice cut through the general conversation. "Well, if it isn't the Valley's newest Chinese sympathizer, come to brag about your wife's magic tricks?" The exchange went quiet. Men shifted uncomfortably, not sure where this was heading, but sensing trouble. Caleb kept his voice level. "Just here to sell hay, Sam. Nothing more complicated than that." "Nothing complicated?" Sam laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. Nothing complicated about bringing in foreigners to take jobs from American hands. Nothing complicated about filling women's heads with heathen practices. Nothing complicated about turning a valley that was built by good Christian folk into some kind of Chinese experiment. My wife is teaching people how to survive a drought," Caleb said, still calm but feeling his patience wear thin. "If you've got a problem with that, it says more about you than her." "I've got a problem with a lot of things." Sam stepped closer, his bulk intimidating, his face flushed with anger or whiskey or both. "I've got a problem with outsiders coming in and acting like they know better than people who've worked this land for generations. I've got a problem with my own son betraying me to work for the likes of you. And I've got a real problem with everyone acting like that woman's some kind of savior when she's just a—" Caleb's fist connected with Sam's jaw before the insult could be completed. The older man went down hard, crashing into a stack of grain sacks. For a moment, there was perfect silence. Then Thomas was pulling his father up, while other men grabbed Caleb's arms to prevent a second strike. Sam wiped blood from his split lip, his eyes blazing with triumph rather than pain. "You just assaulted me in front of a dozen witnesses, Turner. That's going to cost you." "Worth it," Caleb said, his knuckles throbbing. "Call my wife names again and it'll cost you more than a split lip." Sheriff Morrison, Frank's younger brother, pushed through the crowd, his expression weary. "All right, that's enough. Sam, go get that lip looked at. Caleb, come with me." They walked to the small jailhouse, though Morrison didn't actually lock Caleb up. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat behind his desk with a sigh. "You couldn't have just walked away?" He was about to call Leon something I won't repeat. "I figured as much." Morrison sipped his coffee. "Sam's been spoiling for a fight since his boy left. You gave him what he wanted. So what happens now?" "Now he can press charges if he wants. Assault and battery. You'd likely pay a fine, maybe spend a few days in here." Morrison gestured around the small cell. But here's the thing. Everyone in that exchange heard what Sam was about to say. Most of those men have wives and daughters who've learned from Leon. They've eaten vegetables from gardens she helped plan. They've watched her work miracles with animals and water and stubborn earth. So if this goes to trial, Sam's going to find out real quick that the Valley's sympathy isn't with him anymore. You think he'll drop it? I think his pride won't let him drop it, but his common sense might. We'll see. Morrison leaned back in his chair. For what it's worth, I probably would have hit him too. Man talks that way about another man's wife. He's asking for consequences. Caleb was released 2 hours later with a warning to stay away from Sam Pratt. He rode home as the sun was setting, dreading having to tell Leon what had happened. But when he arrived, she was in the garden with Martha Henderson and Mrs. Sanchez, all 3 women laughing about something while they harvested tomatoes. Leanne looked up as he approached, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. She excused herself from the other women and met him at the fence. What happened? He told her everything, the confrontation, the punch, the arrest, Morrison's predictions. She listened without interruption, her face calm and unreadable. "You hit him," she said when he finished. "Yes." "Because he was going to insult me." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, studying his face. Then she reached up and touched his bruised knuckles gently. "Did it hurt?" "My hand or my pride?" "Either." "Both." He caught her hand, held it. "I'm sorry. I know you don't need me fighting your battles. You're stronger than I'll ever be in the ways that matter." But when he opened his mouth to say whatever poison he had ready, "You forgot to be wise and remembered only to be loyal." She smiled, and there was warmth in it. "This is not entirely a bad thing, though perhaps less useful than wisdom. But I am not angry. How can I be angry when my husband's first instinct is to defend my honor? Even when it was stupid? Especially when it was stupid. Wisdom I can provide for both of us. But loyalty?" She squeezed his hand. "That is something we give each other freely, without calculation. So yes, it was stupid, and yes, I am grateful." Sam Pratt did press charges. The trial was set for mid-September, which gave both sides time to prepare. But as Morrison had predicted, sentiment in the valley had shifted. When word spread about what Sam had been about to say when Caleb hit him, the sympathy that might have gone to an older man assaulted by a younger one evaporated like morning dew. Women who'd learned from Leon spoke up in defense of the Turners. Men who'd watered their stock at the Turner well or sought Caleb's advice about managing drought conditions made their support known. Even Reverend Michaels, who generally stayed out of temporal disputes, mentioned in his Sunday sermon that a community was known by how it treated its most vulnerable members, and that kindness should be repaid with kindness. The Pratts found themselves increasingly isolated. Thomas stopped coming to town entirely, ashamed of his father's crusade. And 3 days before the trial was set to begin, Daniel rode up to the Turner Ranch looking troubled. "I need to talk to you both," he said, dismounting near where Caleb and Leanne were working on a new chicken coop. "It's about my father." They sat in the shade of the rebuilt barn while Daniel gathered his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Pa's planning something. I don't know what exactly, but he's been meeting with some men from the mining camps up north. Rough types. The kind you hire when you want things done that you can't do yourself." Caleb felt cold settle in his stomach. "You think he's going to try something violent?" "I think he's desperate and humiliated, which makes him dangerous." Daniel looked between them. The trial's just a sideshow. Win or lose, it doesn't give him what he really wants, which is you gone and this ranch failed. So he's looking at other options. We should tell the sheriff, Leon said. Tell him what? That my father's meeting with some rough men? That's not illegal. And I've got no proof of any actual plan. Well, Daniel twisted his hat in his hands. I just wanted to warn you. Keep your eyes open. Maybe sleep with your rifle close. After Daniel left, Caleb and Leanne discussed their options. They could hire guards, but that costs money they'd rather spend on ranch improvements. They could confront Sam directly, but that would likely escalate things. They could do nothing and trust that the sheriff and community support would be enough deterrent. In the end, they chose vigilance. Caleb started making rounds of the property each night before bed, checking the barn and, well, making sure nothing was disturbed. Leon kept the rifle loaded and near the door, and they told their neighbors, Frank especially, to watch for strangers or suspicious activity. The trial came and went quickly. The judge heard testimony from both sides, listened to witnesses describe what had been said and done, and rendered his verdict with the weary air of a man tired of mediating disputes between stubborn men. Mr. Turner, you are guilty of assault. That's the law, plain and simple. However, considering the provocation and Mr. Pratt's established pattern of harassment toward you and your wife, I'm imposing a fine of $5 and calling it settled. Both of you will stay away from each other unless business requires otherwise. And if I see either of you in my courtroom again over this matter, I'll double the penalties. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor, Caleb said. Sam said nothing, his face dark with rage, but he nodded once, sharply, and left the courtroom without looking back. That's not the end of it, Frank said quietly as they walked out into the September sunshine. You know that, right? Sam's not the kind to let things go. I know. Caleb squinted against the bright light. But we've done all we can. Now we just wait and see what comes. What came was fire again, but this time they were ready. Caleb woke to Diablo's screaming. The stallion had developed an attachment to Leon and seemed to sense danger before it materialized. He was up and armed in seconds, looking out to see 3 figures near the well on the ridge, silhouetted against moonlight. They were doing something to the well structure, moving with purpose. Even from a distance, Caleb could see they were placing objects around the stone walls they'd built to protect the water source. Dynamite, he breathed, and felt his blood turn to ice. They're going to blow the well. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door before Leon could stop him. But she was right behind him, carrying the shotgun and moving with the same swift efficiency that characterized everything she did. They ran toward the ridge, and the figures must have heard them coming because they scattered. Caleb reached the well and saw his worst fears confirmed. 6 sticks of dynamite wired together, fuse already lit and burning down fast. Get back! He shouted at Leon, but she was already moving forward. How long? She demanded. Maybe a minute, maybe less. We need to run. Instead, she yanked the burning fuse from the dynamite with her bare hands, threw it into the grass, and stamped it out. Then she carefully disconnected the wires, her movement steady despite the danger, until the dynamite was neutralized and the threat was gone. Caleb stood there, his heart hammering, watching his wife handle explosives like she'd been doing it her whole life. Where did you learn to do that? Railroad camps in California. I saw men use dynamite to clear rock. Watched them wire it, light it, run from it. She picked up the sticks carefully. The principle is simple once you understand it, and fear makes you stupid, so I refuse to be afraid. Movement in the darkness caught Caleb's attention. The 3 men were mounting horses on the far side of the ridge, preparing to flee. One of them, broader and taller than the others, turned back for just a moment. Though shadows hid his face, Caleb would have bet everything he owned that it was Sam Pratt. Sheriff needs to know about this, he said. But when Morrison arrived at dawn with his deputy, examining the dynamite in the scene, his expression was grim. I can investigate, but unless you can identify who did this, there's not much I can charge anyone with. You see faces? Just silhouettes. Then it's your word about who you think it was, not enough for arrest. Morrison ran his hand through his hair in frustration. I'll talk to Sam, make it clear we know someone tried this. Might be enough to scare him off. But Caleb, Leon, you two need to be careful. Someone willing to use dynamite is past the point of reason. After Morrison left, Caleb and Leanne sat by their well. their precious, hard-won water source that someone had tried to destroy. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and birds were starting their morning songs. "We could leave," Caleb said finally. "Sell the ranch, start over somewhere else, somewhere without enemies waiting to kill us." Leon looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "Do you want to leave?" Did he? A month ago, maybe even a week ago, the answer might have been yes. But now, sitting here beside the water they'd dug through 23 feet of rock to find, on land they'd brought back from death through sweat and stubbornness, next to the woman who'd taught him that impossible was just difficult wearing a scary mask, now the answer was clear. "No," he said. "I don't want to leave. This is our home. We built it. We're not surrendering it to fear." "Good." She leaned against his shoulder. "Because neither am I. My grandfather died digging for water, but I found it, and I will not let small, frightened men destroy what we created through belief and work and love. So we stay. We stay. We rebuild if we must. We dig again if necessary. We keep creating beauty in spite of those who worship destruction." She tilted her face up to the rising sun. "That is how we win. Not by matching their violence, but by refusing to let it make us small." Over the following weeks, they fortified their position without making it look like a fortress. Daniel helped build a small cabin near the well where someone could sleep and keep watch. They trained Diablo to alert at the approach of strangers. They made sure neighbors knew to report suspicious activity. But they also continued the work of living. The garden grew. The cattle multiplied. Leon held her classes and gave her advice, and slowly, steadily built a community that valued knowledge over fear, cooperation over competition. And in late September, when the first real rain in over a year finally came, the valley transformed overnight. Grass pushed up through the dust. Wildflowers bloomed. The creek ran again, and the sound of flowing water was like music after months of silence. The drought was breaking, and the Turner Ranch, with its well still flowing, its garden lush and productive, its reputation as a place where miracles happened through hard work and stubborn hope, stood as proof that survival was possible if you were willing to dig deep enough and trust in what you couldn't yet see. The rain changed everything, but not in the ways Caleb expected. He'd assumed that once water returned to the valley naturally, the well on the ridge would become less important, that people would return to their own sources, and the Turner Ranch would fade back into obscurity. Instead, something else happened. The valley remembered. They remembered who had water when there was none, who had shared it freely even with enemies, who had taught them to garden in drought conditions, to find water where professionals said it didn't exist, to believe that knowledge and persistence could overcome impossible odds. And when the rain came and crops began to recover, people didn't forget those lessons. They built on them. Martha Henderson started a women's cooperative, pooling resources to buy seeds and tools, sharing labor during harvest. Mrs. Sanchez organized a rotation system where ranchers helped each other with major projects, barn raisings, fence repairs, well maintenance. Frank Morrison convinced the territorial government to send an agricultural expert to study Lyon's methods, hoping to spread them to other drought-prone regions. The Turner Ranch became a center of activity, with visitors arriving weekly to learn, to share ideas, to simply be part of something larger than their own survival. Lynn handled it all with the same patient grace she brought to everything, teaching anyone who asked while somehow still managing the endless work of the ranch itself. But Sam Pratt's hatred didn't dissolve with the first rain. If anything, it intensified. Each success the Turners achieved, each neighbor who sought Leon's advice, each mention of the miracle well or the Chinese woman's wisdom, it was salt in a wound that wouldn't heal. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the kind of crisp, clear days that made Montana feel like the edge of heaven. The garden was producing its final harvest before winter, and Caleb spent a morning helping Leon preserve vegetables. Tomatoes for sauce, beans for drying, squash for root cellar storage. Daniel was out mending fence with Thomas, who'd started coming around more often now that their father's behavior had become too toxic to ignore. They were laughing about something, Leon teaching Caleb the proper way to slice vegetables for pickling, when hoofbeats announced a visitor. Caleb looked up to see Sheriff Morrison riding hard, his face urgent. "Sam Pratt's missing," Morrison said without preamble. Been gone 3 days. His hands say he left mumbling about finishing things, about making people pay. I'm worried he's planning something desperate.
You think he's coming here? Caleb wiped his hands on a towel, already moving toward where he kept the rifle. I think he's lost whatever was left of his mind. His ranch is failing despite the rain. Turns out spite's a poor substitute for good management. He's got nothing left but his pride and his hate, and that makes him dangerous. Morrison dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol. I've got deputies watching the roads, but this is a lot of territory to cover. You two need to be ready for anything. Leanne had gone very still, her hands pausing in their work. The well, she said quietly. He will try again for the well. It is what he hates most, the symbol of everything he thinks we took from him. We've got Daniel watching it, Caleb said, and the cabin's fortified. Daniel's one man against whatever Sam might bring. Morrison looked between them. I can post a deputy here, but it'll take a few hours to arrange. Then we'll manage until he arrives. Leanne set down her knife with careful precision. Mr. Morrison, how desperate do you think Sam has become? The sheriff's expression darkened. Desperate enough that I'm more worried about him hurting himself than you, if I'm being honest. A man who's lost everything and knows it, that's a man with nothing left to lose. And those are the most dangerous kind. After Morrison left to continue his search, Caleb and Leanne prepared. They loaded extra ammunition, secured the livestock where they could be easily protected, made sure all the lanterns had oil. Daniel and Thomas came down from the fence line, and together they established a watch rotation. Night fell with no sign of Sam. Then another day passed, and another. The tension became exhausting, the constant vigilance wearing on nerves already stretched thin. By the third night, Caleb was beginning to wonder if Morrison had been wrong, if Sam had simply run off to start over somewhere else. That's when the barn caught fire. Not the main barn this time, they'd been watching that too carefully. But the smaller storage barn where they kept hay and equipment. The flames were visible from the house, bright and hungry, and Caleb's first thought was the horses. But Diablo and the others were in the main barn, safe. This was meant as distraction. The well, Leanne said, already running. He wants us focused here while he destroys what we built there. Caleb grabbed his rifle and followed, leaving Daniel and Thomas to fight the fire. The path to the ridge was dark, treacherous with loose rocks and unexpected shadows. But they knew it by heart now, had walked it hundreds of times, and they moved with swift efficiency. They crested the ridge to find Sam Pratt standing beside the well, dynamite in his hands, a lit lantern at his feet. But he wasn't alone. 3 men from the mining camp stood with him, rough-looking types who'd clearly been promised payment for their help. They had rifles, and when Caleb and Lion appeared, the weapons came up. That's far enough, Sam called out. His voice was strange, too high, too tight, like a wire about to snap. You come any closer, and I light this fuse. Your precious miracle well becomes a crater. Caleb raised his hands slowly, the rifle held loose and unthreatening. Sam, don't do this. The drought's over. The valley's recovering. You can rebuild your ranch, start fresh. This doesn't help anyone. Start fresh? Sam laughed, and the sound had edges sharp enough to cut. With what? My cattle are dead or dying. My sons have betrayed me for you. The whole valley treats me like a joke while they bow and scrape to your Chinese whore. You took everything from me. We took nothing that wasn't already lost, Leanne said, her voice calm despite the rifles pointed at them. Your pride destroyed your ranch long before the drought. Your cruelty drove away your sons. Your hatred isolated you from neighbors who would have helped. We did not do this to you. You did it to yourself. Sam's face twisted with rage. Shut your mouth. You think you can come to this country, to my valley, and tell me about myself? You think because you can find water and grow vegetables that makes you better than people who've worked this land for generations? I think knowledge has no nationality, Leon replied. I think water flows for everyone regardless of where they were born. I think you are angry because a small Chinese woman succeeded where you failed, and your pride cannot bear it, so you want to destroy what you cannot possess. But Sam, her voice softened slightly, destroying this well will not restore what you have lost. It will only prove that you were always as small as you feared. For a moment, something flickered in Sam's eyes. Pain, maybe. Recognition.
the truth of Leon's words landing like blows. But then his face hardened again, and he reached for the fuse. A shot rang out. Not from Caleb or the hired men, but from the darkness behind them. Sam jerked, the dynamite falling from his hands, and clutched his shoulder. The hired gun spun, confused, as Daniel Pratt stepped into the lantern light, rifle smoking. "That's enough, Pa," Daniel said, his voice shaking but determined. "I won't let you do this. Not to them. Not to yourself." "You shot me!" Sam stared at his son in disbelief, blood seeping between his fingers. "Your own father. I shot your shoulder so you dropped the dynamite before you killed yourself and everyone else. Here." Daniel moved closer, keeping the rifle trained on his father. "It's over. The hate, the revenge, all of it, it's done." Thomas appeared behind Daniel, looking torn between horror and relief. The hired men, seeing the situation deteriorate, slowly lowered their rifles. They'd been promised easy money for helping terrorize some foreigners, not signing up for a family tragedy. Sheriff Morrison arrived minutes later with 2 deputies, apparently having followed the sound of the gunshot. He took in the scene, Sam bleeding but alive, the dynamite on the ground, the standoff that had just diffused itself, and shook his head with weary resignation. "Sam Pratt, you're under arrest for attempted destruction of property, arson, and making terroristic threats. You 3," he gestured at the hired guns, "are accomplices. Deputy Wallace, get them secured." As the deputies moved to arrest the men, Morrison approached Daniel, who was staring at his rifle as if surprised to find it in his hands. "You did the right thing," Morrison said quietly. "Saved your father's life, probably. He lights that dynamite with you all standing this close. Pieces of Sam Pratt end up scattered across the ridge." "He's still my father," Daniel said, and his voice broke. "Even after everything, he's still my father, and I shot him." "You stopped him," Leon corrected, moving to Daniel's side. "There is a difference. Love does not mean allowing someone to destroy themselves. Sometimes it means doing the hard thing, the painful thing, because it is the only thing that might save them." Sam was loaded onto Morrison's horse, still clutching his wounded shoulder, still glaring at everyone with impotent rage. But there was something else in his eyes now, too. Defeat. The final acknowledgement that he'd lost completely, not just the battle with the Turners, but the war with his own demons. As they led him away, Thomas approached his brother. The 2 men stood in the lantern light, both of them looking lost and exhausted. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. "Now we run the ranch," Daniel said. "Keep it going until Pa gets out of prison, if he gets out. Try to salvage what's left of the family name. Try to be better men than our father taught us to be." He looked at Caleb and Leon. "If you'll still have me working here. I understand if you don't want a Pratt anywhere near your property after tonight." "You saved the well," Caleb said. "Saved us, probably. Far as I'm concerned, you've more than earned your place here. Both of you, if Thomas wants it." The brothers exchanged looks. Some silent communication passed between them. Years of shared history and pain and hope for something different. Finally, Thomas nodded. "Yeah," he said.
"Yeah, I think I'd like that." The fire at the storage barn had been contained by the time they returned. Damage was significant, but not catastrophic. The hay could be replaced. The tools could be repaired or rebought. What mattered was that the main barn stood safe, the animals were unharmed, and the well still flowed clean and pure on the ridge. As dawn broke over the Turner Ranch, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Caleb and Leon stood together watching the sunrise. Daniel and Thomas had gone to clean up and check on the livestock. The excitement was over. Life would return to its normal rhythms of work and season and slow, steady building. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "I'm thinking about Sam Pratt," Leon said, "about how fear makes people small, how pride becomes poison, how he had the same land, the same opportunities as everyone else, but his hatred made him blind to possibility. Some people can't be helped. Perhaps. Or perhaps help must come in forms they do not expect, from directions they cannot anticipate." She leaned into his embrace. "His sons will run his ranch now. They will do it differently. Better. And maybe, when Sam is old and his time in prison has worn away some of his anger, he will see his sons thriving and understand what he threw away. Understanding comes late for some people, but it can still come,
But October gave way to November, and the valley settled into the routines of preparation for winter. But this winter would be different from the last. Barns were full of hay, root cellars were stocked with preserved food, cisterns and wells held adequate water. The community had learned lessons from the drought, had grown closer through shared hardship, and now approached the cold months with confidence rather than fear. The Turner Ranch thrived. The garden, put to bed for winter, had produced enough surplus to share with 3 families who'd struggled with their harvests. The cattle herd had grown to 15 head, not as many as before Margaret died, but enough to sustain the ranch and provide breeding stock for the future. The horses were sleek and healthy, and Diablo had become so gentle under Leon's patient work that Frank Morrison's teenage daughter could ride him. Daniel and Thomas Pratt worked their family ranch with new energy, implementing techniques they'd learned from Leon. They dammed their creek to create a small reservoir, planted drought-resistant crops, started rebuilding their herd with better management practices. The Pratt Ranch would never be what it was under Sam's tenure. That legacy was too poisoned, but it could be something new, something better. Sam himself remained in the territorial prison, awaiting trial. The charges were serious enough that he'd likely spend years behind bars. Daniel visited once a month, though he never spoke about what passed between them. Some wounds, Caleb understood, took longer to heal than others. The women's cooperative that Martha Henderson had started flourished, with Leon as an unofficial advisor. They'd established a seed library, a tool-sharing system, and regular meetings where women shared knowledge about everything from preserving food to treating livestock ailments. What had started as survival strategy was becoming community infrastructure. And on a cold November morning, Leon stood in the kitchen making breakfast while Caleb read a letter that had arrived from the Territorial Agricultural Office. They wanted to document her methods officially, publish a guide for other drought-prone regions, possibly even hire her as a consultant to travel and teach. "What do you think?" he asked, setting down the letter. Leon cracked eggs into a pan, her movements precise and practiced. "I think knowledge should be shared. I think if what I have learned can help others survive and thrive, then sharing it is obligation, not option. It would mean travel, being away from the ranch sometimes. We have help now. Daniel and Thomas are capable. You are capable." She smiled at him over her shoulder. "And I think perhaps you worry too much about me leaving because you forget that I always come back. This is my home. You are my home. Everything else is just temporary journey." In December, the first real snow fell, thick and heavy, the kind that would have terrified them during the drought, but now felt like blessing. They had water, food, fuel for the stove, and each other. The ranch was quiet under its white blanket, peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than given. Caleb found Leanne in the barn one afternoon, sitting in the hay beside Diablo's stall. The great stallion had his head lowered, letting her stroke his nose while she hummed something in Chinese, probably the same song she'd used to lead him from the burning barn months ago. "Thinking about something?" Caleb asked, sitting beside her. "Thinking about journeys," she said. "How I left China as a child, crossed an ocean, worked in San Francisco believing that was my destination. How I answered your letter thinking Montana was an ending, but really, all of it was beginning. The journey continues." "Any regrets?" She considered this seriously, as she considered everything. "I regret the pain that came with it. The people who were cruel because they feared what was different. The violence that Sam Pratt tried to bring to what we built. But the journey itself? No regrets. Because it brought me here. To you. To this land. To this life we are creating together." "It's a good life," Caleb agreed. "Not easy. Never going to be easy." "I did not come here for easy." She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who'd worked side by side through impossible challenges and come through stronger. "I came here for real, for true, for partnership and purpose, for the chance to prove that broken things can heal, dead earth can live, water exists even in the driest land if you are willing to dig deep enough." Through the barn door, they could see snow falling steadily, covering the ranch in fresh white. The garden slept beneath it, waiting for spring. The well on the ridge flowed steady and true, its water channeled to where it was needed most. The land rested, gathering strength for the next season's work. In the main house, Daniel was cooking dinner. He'd turned out to have unexpected culinary skills, much to everyone's surprise. Thomas was repairing tack, preparing for when the snow cleared enough to work the horses again.
The fire crackled in the stove. Lanterns glowed warm against the gathering dark. This was what they'd built. Not just a ranch or a water source or even a community, though it was all those things. They'd built a different way of being, one that valued knowledge over ignorance, cooperation over competition, mercy over revenge. One that proved outsiders could become insiders through work and respect. That impossible was just another word for difficult, that water would flow for those stubborn enough to dig for it. As winter deepened and the valley settled into the quiet months, stories about the Turner Ranch spread beyond Montana territory. The Chinese woman who'd found water where none existed. The rancher who'd married her and discovered that foreign wisdom could save American land. The miracle well that still flowed when everything around it had died. People added embellishments, as people always do with stories. Some versions had Leon possessing mystical powers. Others claimed the well would never run dry, that it was touched by divine blessing. A few suggested that the water had healing properties, that crops grown with it were more nutritious, that livestock that drank from it lived longer. Caleb and Lion heard these stories with amusement. The truth was simpler and more profound. She'd listened to the land, read the signs that anyone could read if they paid attention, applied knowledge passed down through generations of people who'd survived by understanding water's secrets. There was no magic, only the persistent application of wisdom combined with backbreaking work. But if people needed to believe in miracles, Leanne said, let them believe. Because sometimes belief was the thing that made people willing to dig through 23 feet of rock. Sometimes the miracle wasn't the water. It was the faith that water existed, waiting to be found. On Christmas Eve, they held a gathering at the ranch. Half the valley came, families bringing food, children running between adults' legs, horses tethered in lines outside the barn. Inside the house, warmed by the stove and crowded with people, the celebration felt like more than just a holiday. It felt like acknowledgement, like the valley saying, we see what you built here. We see how you chose mercy over revenge, work over surrender, hope over despair. We see, and we want to be part of it. Martha Henderson gave Leon a quilt she'd made, traditional American pattern, but executed in red and gold fabrics, a fusion of cultures stitched together with careful hands. Frank Morrison presented them with a deed to an additional 50 acres adjoining their property, land his family had owned but no longer needed. Even Reverend Michaels mentioned them in his blessing, talking about strangers becoming family, about outsiders teaching insiders how to see their own land with fresh eyes. Daniel and Thomas gave them a hand-carved sign reading Turner Ranch, established 1883, with a second line added beneath, where water flows and hope grows. It was sentimental and slightly ridiculous, but Lion's eyes grew wet when she saw it, and Caleb felt his throat tighten. Thank you, Leon said to the gathered crowd, her English still careful but confident now. When I came here, I was stranger, outsider, someone to be feared or rejected. But you, she gestured to encompass everyone. You chose to see past fear, to learn instead of condemn, to build together instead of tear down. This valley could have been a place of division and hate. Instead, it is becoming a place of cooperation and growth. That is not my doing. That is all of you, choosing every day to be better than easy, to be kinder than comfortable, to dig deeper than seems possible. So thank you for welcoming me, for teaching me, for being the America I hoped existed when I crossed the ocean to get here. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished speaking. Then someone started clapping, probably Martha, and the applause spread until everyone was clapping, some people wiping their eyes, others grinning broadly. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Caleb and Leon stood on the porch watching stars emerge in the clear winter sky. The snow had stopped, leaving everything crystalline and perfect. Do you ever think about the letter? Caleb asked. The one I sent to San Francisco that started all this? Sometimes. I think about how desperate we both were, how we reached across distance toward possibility we could not guarantee. She took his hand. I think about how close I came to not answering it. There were other letters, other men, and yours was so honest about hardship that it would have been easy to choose something that promised easier life. Why did you choose mine? Because you did not lie. You told truth about difficulty, about loneliness, about work that never ends. And I thought, this is man who will not lie to me later either.
This is a man who understands that real partnership requires honesty about the hard things. She looked up at him. I was right. You have never lied to me. Not once. Even when truth was complicated or uncomfortable, you have been honest. That is worth more than easy promises. I'm glad you came, Caleb said simply. Glad you saw that letter and thought a lonely rancher in Montana was worth the journey. I'm glad you wrote it. Glad you were desperate enough to take a chance on stranger. Glad we both chose to dig when everyone said there was no water to be found. She squeezed his hand. Look at what we made. Not just ranch or well, but family, community, future. We made something that will last beyond drought, beyond prejudice, beyond our own lifetimes. In the spring, the territorial agricultural expert arrived to document Leon's methods. She spent 2 weeks showing him everything: how to read the land for water signs, how to practice companion planting, how to manage livestock in drought conditions, how to build community resilience through shared knowledge. He wrote it all down carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and when he left, he promised the guide would be published by summer. By the time the guide was distributed, thick booklet with detailed illustrations and Leanne's techniques explained in clear language, water management experts from 3 territories had written requesting permission to visit. Universities wanted her to speak. Agricultural organizations wanted her to consult. The quiet Chinese woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach less than a year ago had become an authority, her knowledge sought from people who would never have looked twice at her in different circumstances. But despite the attention and opportunities, Leanne always came back to the ranch, back to the garden and the animals, and the well that still flowed pure and cold, back to Caleb and the life they were building together, season by season, harvest by harvest. The Pratt brothers thrived under new management. The ranch would never be friendly with the Turners. Some histories were too complicated for easy reconciliation, but there was respect now. An acknowledgement that they were all trying to build something lasting in unforgiving land, and that made them allies, even if not friends. Sam Pratt was released after serving 2 years, diminished and quieter. He moved to a small cabin on the edge of his son's property, helping with minor tasks but no longer trying to control everything. Some said prison had broken him. Others said it had just worn away the hardest edges, leaving someone more human underneath. Occasionally, Caleb would see him in town, and they'd nod at each other, not friendship, but acknowledgement. 2 men who'd both learned hard lessons about pride and surrender and the narrow margin between survival and failure. Years passed. The garden expanded, the herd grew, children appeared, first a daughter with Leon's dark eyes and Caleb's stubborn chin, then a son who loved the horses with the same intuitive understanding his mother showed. The well on the ridge never failed, its water flowing through drought and abundance alike, a testament to the value of looking deeper than surface observations. And on warm evenings, when work was done and the children were asleep, Caleb and Leon would sometimes walk up to the ridge and sit beside their well, listening to the water flow and remembering the 7 days they'd spent digging through impossible rock toward an uncertain dream. Worth it? Caleb would ask, and Leon would smile. Every bruise, every doubt, every moment of wondering if we were fools digging holes in the ground. She'd take his hand, calloused palm against calloused palm, 2 people who'd built something lasting through shared work. Because we didn't just find water. We found what happens when you refuse to surrender, when you trust that impossible is just difficult wearing a mask, when you dig deep enough to reach what everyone else thought was gone. The water would keep flowing, clean and cold and constant. And the ranch would keep growing, season after season, proof that the best things in life aren't given, they're earned through sweat and faith, and the stubborn belief that broken earth can bloom again if you're willing to work for it. This was their miracle, not magic or divine intervention, but the simple, profound truth that water exists even in the driest land. You just have to be brave enough to dig for it, patient enough to keep digging when everyone says you're a fool, and stubborn enough to believe that tomorrow might bring the sound of water erupting from stone. And when it does, when your hands break through that final layer of rock and feel the rush of cold, life-giving water, you understand that the real miracle was never the water itself. It was the courage to keep digging, the partnership that made impossible work possible, the love that grew in the spaces between exhaustion and hope. That was the story of the Turner Ranch, of Caleb and Leon, of water found in the driest season, of two desperate people who reached across an ocean toward each other and built something that would outlast them both. And the water flowed on.